My name is Bethany, and at 33 years old, I work as a waitress in one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago. Last night, a billionaire came into my section and ordered an expensive bottle of wine. When he reached out his hand to take his glass, his French cuff slipped back, and I saw his inner wrist. There was a tattoo of a small red rose with thorns forming an intricate infinity symbol. I froze completely. My mother, who passed away when I was a teenager, had the exact same tattoo. It was the exact same design and on the exact same wrist. I looked at him and said, "Sir, my mother has a tattoo just like yours." He dropped his wine glass and it shattered across the hardwood floor. He looked at me while the color drained from his face. He asked for my mother's name. When I told him, he went completely pale. He stared at me and said, "I thought you died 33 years ago." Before I tell you how this encounter changed everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family member who tried to destroy your life and treat you like a burden. Just 30 minutes before that shocking moment, my night was a living nightmare. I was working a grueling double shift at Lumiere. The restaurant was a fortress of crystal chandeliers and white linen tablecloths, where the elite of Chicago came to show off their wealth and status. My feet ached from standing for 10 hours, and my back throbbed with every step, but I had absolutely no choice. I was trapped under the crushing weight of a $60,000 medical debt owed to my Aunt Linda. Linda constantly claimed she had spent that money on my mother Elaine during her final days in hospice care. Ever since I was a vulnerable teenager, Linda held that debt over my head like a heavy weapon. She used legal loopholes to garnish my wages, forcing me to work myself to the bone just to survive paying for a small apartment and basic groceries. The evening had started like any other busy Friday night until the host seated my VIP table. I felt my stomach drop to the floor when I saw who was walking toward my section. It was Aunt Linda and my 30-year-old cousin Ashley. They were accompanied by Ashley's new fiancé Preston and his incredibly wealthy and judgmental parents. They were here to celebrate their engagement, and out of all the servers in the building, they had specifically requested my section. They did not do this to support me or leave a good tip. They did it deliberately to remind me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Linda wore a designer dress that cost more than my monthly rent, and Ashley flaunted a massive diamond ring that sparkled under the restaurant lights. Preston and his parents wore expressions of permanent superiority, judging the elegant decor and the expensive menu. I took a deep breath, forcing a polite customer service smile onto my face, and approached their table with a silver tray of complimentary champagne. Ashley was showing off her ring to Preston's mother, while Linda bragged loudly about the exclusive country club wedding they were planning for the summer. I poured the champagne with steady hands, trying my best to remain invisible and professional. But Ashley would never allow me to simply fade into the background. It was not enough for her to be the center of attention. She needed me to be visibly beneath her. She looked up at me with a cruel smirk playing on her lips. As I set her drink down, she reached for her $150 crystal champagne flute. She maintained direct cold eye contact with me and then deliberately tipped her hand. The expensive crystal crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into 100 sharp pieces. The loud noise instantly silenced the surrounding tables. "Oh my goodness!" Ashley gasped with fake innocence, placing a hand over her chest. "Bethany, you really should be more careful when you set things down. You are always so clumsy and careless." I knew she had pushed it on purpose, but arguing would only make the situation worse and jeopardize my job. I grabbed a thick cloth towel from my apron and got down on my knees in front of the entire restaurant to clean up the spilled champagne and broken glass. As I scrubbed the sticky floor, Linda decided it was the perfect time to share my painful history with Preston's parents. She leaned forward and spoke loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear every single word. "You have to forgive my niece," Linda said with a theatrical sigh, shaking her head. "We took her in out of the goodness of our hearts when her deadbeat mother died and left her with absolutely nothing. We paid all her hospital bills and tried to give Bethany a good, loving home. We sacrificed so much for her. And this is how she repays us by dropping out of life to serve our drinks. She just has no ambition or gratitude. I kept my head down as a sharp piece of broken glass cut into my finger. The humiliation burned hot in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Preston's parents looked down at me with absolute disgust. The mother adjusted her pearl necklace and whispered something to her husband, who shook his head in disapproval. I was being painted as the charity case, the ungrateful burden, the ultimate family embarrassment. I gathered the broken crystal onto my tray and stood up to leave, hoping to escape the staring eyes of the other patrons. But Ashley stopped me with a sharp, commanding voice. "Bethany, wait," Ashley said, her tone dripping with entitlement. "Since you are family and you clearly cannot afford to buy us a real engagement gift, you are going to pay for our dinner tonight. The bill will probably be around $800. Consider it your contribution to my happiness since my mother paid for your entire life." I stared at her in complete shock. "I cannot afford an $800 bill, Ashley. You know that. I barely have enough money to pay my rent and buy food after Aunt Linda takes her cut of my paycheck every single month. Please do not do this to me tonight." Linda narrowed her eyes at me, dropping her polite facade completely. "You will pay for our dinner, Bethany. If you refuse, I will personally call the owner of this restaurant. You know very well that we are close friends. I will tell him you were incredibly rude to your VIP guests, and I will have you fired on the spot. Then how will you pay off the massive debt you owe me? You will be out on the street by the end of the month." I stood there holding the heavy tray of broken glass, feeling completely trapped and suffocated. My chest was tight with rising panic and helpless anger. They had cornered me perfectly. If I lost this waitressing job, I would be financially ruined. I would lose my apartment and default on the payments Linda legally demanded from me. I swallowed my pride and nodded silently, agreeing to their cruel extortion. I turned away from their mocking, victorious smiles and walked back to the serving station in the back of the dining room. I set the tray down and took a few seconds to breathe, fighting back the hot tears that threatened to spill over my eyelashes. I could not let them see me cry. I refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking me completely. I composed myself, fixed my posture, and smoothed the wrinkles from my uniform apron. I prepared to serve my next table, bearing the injustice deep inside my heart. I grabbed a bottle of expensive vintage wine and walked over to a solitary older man sitting quietly in the corner booth. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, and he exuded an aura of quiet, intimidating power. I forced a polite smile and approached him, completely unaware that he was a billionaire, and that the next few words we exchanged would alter the course of my entire life, and finally give me the power to fight back against the family that had abused me for years. My hands were still trembling slightly as I stood beside the secluded corner booth. The man sat with his back to the bustling dining room, a deliberate choice that afforded him absolute privacy in a place built for people watching. He was reviewing a thick, leather-bound portfolio, a solid gold pen resting loosely between his fingers. Even from a few feet away, I could sense the quiet authority radiating from him. He wore a charcoal gray suit that spoke of immense wealth, the kind of old quiet money that did not need to shout or show off with massive diamond rings like my cousin Ashley did. I took a deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down. I desperately needed to focus. If I messed up this service, Aunt Linda would absolutely make good on her threat to have the owner fire me. I was trapped under the crushing weight of a $60,000 medical debt owed directly to her. Linda constantly claimed she had spent that fortune on my mother Elaine during her final days in hospice care. Ever since I was a vulnerable teenager, Linda held that debt over my head like a loaded weapon. She used legal loopholes to garnish my wages, forcing me to work myself to the bone just to survive, paying for a small apartment and basic groceries. The sharp sting from the broken crystal Ashley had forced me to clean up was a burning reminder of my fragile reality. The cut on my finger throbbed inside my bandage, sending sharp waves of pain up my arm with every heartbeat. I stepped up to the table and offered a professional, practiced greeting. Good evening, sir. I have the vintage Cabernet you requested. He did not look up immediately. He simply nodded his eyes, scanning the documents in front of him. I went to work performing the ritual of the wine service with mechanical precision. I presented the label to him, though he merely waved a hand to signal I should proceed. I used my corkscrew to cleanly remove the foil, slicing the metal perfectly, praying my bandaged finger would not bleed through the white cloth napkin draped over my arm. I pulled the cork with a soft pop and placed it on the small silver tray beside his plate. I lifted the heavy glass bottle and carefully poured a small tasting measure into his crystal goblet. The dark ruby liquid swirled around the bowl of the glass. It was only then that he finally set his gold pen down and looked up at me. His eyes were a piercing, stormy gray. They held a profound weariness, the look of a man who had conquered the business world but found his personal life entirely empty. He reached his right hand out to take the goblet by the delicate stem. As his arm extended across the pristine white tablecloth, the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket pulled back slightly. The crisp white French cuff of his shirt caught on his heavy silver watch, pulling the fabric just an inch higher up his arm. That was all it took. My eyes dropped to his exposed inner wrist. I froze completely. The bottle of wine in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I stopped breathing. Time in the busy restaurant seemed to grind to an absolute halt. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of wealthy conversations faded into static white noise. There on the pale skin of his inner wrist was a tattoo. It was small and discreet, easily hidden by a luxury watch or a tailored shirt. It was a single red rose, the petals intricately shaded with dark ink. But the stem did not end in a straight line. Instead, the green thorns twisted and looped back on themselves, forming a perfect, flawless infinity symbol. I knew every single detail of that design. I had traced the exact same lines with my small fingers when I was a little girl. I had memorized the curve of the petals and the sharp points of the thorns during long nights when I could not sleep. My mother Elaine had the exact same tattoo on her exact same right inner wrist. Growing up, I had asked her about it countless times. She would always pull her sleeve down quickly, her eyes clouding with a deep, unreachable sorrow. She told me it was a mistake from her past, a painful reminder of a beautiful life she had to leave behind to keep us both safe. She refused to ever speak the name of the man she had loved. She died when I was just a teenager, taking her deepest secrets to the grave, leaving me completely at the mercy of Aunt Linda. Linda always claimed my father was a nameless deadbeat who abandoned us in the gutter. She said my mother was a foolish woman who got mixed up with bad people. But looking at the wrist of this powerful, terrifyingly wealthy man, my entire reality fractured. This was no coincidence. It was a custom design, deeply personal and impossible to replicate by chance. The artwork was far too specific. My mother had not been a foolish woman with a deadbeat partner. She had been connected to this man sitting right in front of me. I could not stop the words from spilling out of my mouth. The professional barrier between server and guest completely vanished. My voice trembled, but the sentence cut through the ambient noise of the dining room with razor-sharp clarity. "Sir, my mother has a tattoo just like yours." The billionaire froze. His fingers had just brushed the delicate stem of the crystal wine glass. At my words, his hand jerked violently. His fingers lost their grip. The heavy crystal goblet tipped and plummeted over the edge of the table. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The dark red wine splashed across the polished wood, looking violently like blood spilling from a fresh wound. It was the exact same sound of breaking glass that Ashley had caused just minutes ago. But this was fundamentally different. Ashley had broken her glass out of malicious, calculated cruelty, looking down on me as a servant. This man had broken his glass out of pure, unadulterated shock. The loud crash echoed through the restaurant. Several nearby tables turned to look. From the corner of my eye, I could feel Aunt Linda and Ashley glaring at me from across the room. They were probably assuming I had caused another massive disaster. They were likely already plotting how to use this mistake to finally get me fired and thrown out on the street, leaving me completely destitute. But I did not look at them. I could not take my eyes off the man in front of me. He did not look at the broken glass. He did not care about the expensive vintage wine staining his custom leather shoes. The imposing, untouchable aura he had carried just seconds ago completely vanished. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, ghostly white. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw a breath, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He stared up at me, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and desperate, impossible hope. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. The silence stretching between us was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. His voice was barely a rough, broken whisper when he finally managed to speak. "What was your mother's name?" The sheer intensity in his gaze made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. I swallowed hard, my throat completely dry. I felt the overwhelming weight of 33 years of secrets pressing down on my shoulders. I looked into the eyes of a man who shared half my face, a man who wore my mother's secret on his skin, a man whose presence completely destroyed every single lie Aunt Linda had ever told me. "Elaine," I whispered back. Her name was Elaine. The billionaire closed his eyes for a split second, as if I had struck him physically. A violent shudder ran through his broad shoulders, shaking his entire frame. The polished, controlled executive completely fell apart before my eyes. When he opened his eyes again, they were shining with thick, unshed tears. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back and stood up abruptly. He completely ignored the massive mess on the floor, stepping right through the puddle of vintage wine and broken crystal. He stepped close to me. His tall frame towered over me, but he did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of the fog. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping just inches from my face, as if he was terrified that I would disappear into thin air if he actually touched me. He stared deeply into my eyes, searching my features, tracing the lines of my cheekbones and the shape of my jaw, as if he was reading a treasure map he had lost decades ago. He was searching for Elaine in my face, and based on the way his breath hitched, he found her. Harrison Thorne looked at me with his heart completely broken open and said, "I thought you died 33 years ago." The air in the restaurant felt thick and heavy. Harrison Thorne did not break eye contact with me. He reached out and gently took my hand. He completely ignored the fact that my finger was bleeding through the rough cloth bandage. His thumb brushed over my knuckles. He asked me when it happened. I told him my mother passed away when I was 16 years old. I watched the raw grief wash over his face. He had truly loved her. I could see it in the way his broad shoulders suddenly slumped. He asked who raised me after she died. I slowly lifted my hand. I pointed across the dining room toward the VIP table. I pointed directly at Aunt Linda. Harrison turned his head. His sharp gray eyes locked onto the woman sitting in the plush leather booth. The transformation was instantaneous. The vulnerable, grieving man vanished in a heartbeat. In his place stood a terrifying force of nature. He let go of my hand and started walking toward her. He did not rush. His steps were measured, silent, and incredibly deliberate. I followed right behind him, clutching my serving tray against my chest like a metal shield. As we approached the table, Linda was still laughing loudly at something Preston had said. Then she looked up. The champagne glass in her hand stopped halfway to her mouth. All the color violently drained from her face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She recognized him immediately. The 33 years that had passed did not erase the memory of the man she had deceived. Linda gasped. Her voice was a thin, reedy whisper that barely made it past her lips. Preston's mother frowned, looking back and forth between Linda and the imposing man standing at their table. "Linda, do you know this gentleman?" she asked clearly, sensing the sudden, suffocating tension that had descended upon them. Harrison did not acknowledge Preston's parents. He placed both of his hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth and leaned forward. He stared directly into Linda's terrified eyes, trapping her under his intense gaze. "You told me she lost the baby," Harrison said. His voice was low, but it carried across the dining room with deadly precision. 33 years ago, you looked me right in the eye and told me Elaine had a miscarriage. You told me she died from the medical complications. You told me I had absolutely nothing left. The entire table went dead silent. Ashley looked at her mother in absolute shock. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing his engagement dinner had just become the center of a massive scandal. I stood frozen behind Harrison, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was saying. Linda had known my father. She had known who he was my entire life. She had looked at me every single day, knowing exactly who my father was, and she had chosen to keep me trapped in poverty, while constantly telling me I was the unwanted child of a deadbeat loser. Linda's hands were shaking so badly, she had to set her glass down on the table to keep from spilling it. She was trapped. She was sitting directly in front of the wealthy in-laws she was so desperate to impress, and her greatest, most destructive lie had just walked up to her table in a custom-tailored suit. But Linda was a master manipulator. I watched her mind work, frantically calculating her way out of the corner. She took a sharp breath and forced bright tears into her eyes. It was a flawless, terrifying performance. "I had to lie to you, Harrison," Linda cried, placing her hand over her heart. She pitched her voice perfectly so Preston's family would hear the tragic maternal sacrifice in her tone. "Elaine begged me to do it. She made me swear on her life." Harrison did not move a single muscle. "Elaine would never keep my child from me. She did it to protect you," Linda sobbed, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "And to protect the baby. Your family was incredibly dangerous back then, Harrison. We all knew it. Your father threatened to completely destroy Elaine if she stayed with you. He threatened to ruin your career and cut you off without a single cent. Elaine loved you too much to let you lose your future. She ran away to save you. And when she realized she was pregnant, she was absolutely terrified of what your ruthless family would do to a child born out of wedlock." I listened to the lies spilling from her mouth. It was true that my mother had lived in fear. We had moved constantly when I was a child. We never stayed in one place for long. But Linda was spinning this narrative to make herself look like a savior instead of a monster. When Elaine got sick, Linda continued, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "She made me promise to keep Bethany hidden. She said the Thorne family would take Bethany away and crush her. I sacrificed everything to raise this girl. I took her in when Elaine died. I paid all her medical bills. I gave up my own comfortable life to make sure Harrison Thorne's daughter was safe and fed. I bore the weight of that terrible secret for 33 years, just to honor my dying sister's last wish." Preston's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Linda with sudden immense sympathy. The narrative was working perfectly on them. Linda was painting herself as a martyr who had given up everything to protect a vulnerable child from a vicious, wealthy dynasty. She was justifying her lie by blaming my mother and blaming Harrison's family. She made herself the absolute hero of a story where she was actually the villain. Harrison stood completely still. His gray eyes narrowed as he studied Linda's weeping face. He was a billionaire businessman. He spent his entire life negotiating with sharks and destroying corporate competitors. He could spot a liar from a mile away. I knew he did not believe a single word she was saying. But in front of Preston's family and the watching restaurant, he did not start a shouting match. He simply absorbed the information, his jaw clenched incredibly tight. Ashley, meanwhile, had been sitting completely silent. She was staring at Harrison, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. I watched her pull her smartphone out under the table. She quickly typed something into the search bar. I knew exactly what she was doing. She had heard the name Harrison Thorne. She was looking him up on the internet. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened massively as she read the search results. She saw the staggering net worth. She saw the massive corporate empire. She saw the private jets and the global influence. In a fraction of a second, the cruel, mocking cousin who had just forced me to clean up broken glass completely vanished. Ashley shoved her phone back into her designer purse and stood up from her chair. She walked around the table and came to stand right beside me. To my absolute horror, she reached out and wrapped her arm tightly around my shoulders. She pulled me close, acting like we were the best of friends, like we had shared a lifetime of loving, unbreakable sisterhood. "It has been so incredibly hard for us," Ashley said, looking at Harrison with wide, innocent eyes. "Bethany is like a sister to me. We grew up together. My mother gave up so much to make sure Bethany had a good life. We shared everything. We have always protected her. I have always looked out for her. It breaks my heart to know how much pain my mother has carried to keep our sweet Bethany safe all these years. I felt physically sick. The sheer audacity of her performance made my stomach turn into hard knots. Ashley's arm felt like a heavy, suffocating snake wrapping around my neck. This was the exact same woman who just 10 minutes ago had demanded I pay her $800 dinner bill out of my waitressing tips. This was the same woman who called me a charity case and intentionally shattered a glass to humiliate me. And now, simply because she realized my biological father was a billionaire, she was desperate to attach herself to me. She was already calculating exactly how to use my new status to elevate her own wealth and social standing. Preston leaned forward, clearly eager to align himself with the wealthy man standing before them. "It is truly an honor to meet you, Mr. Thorne," Preston said, offering a smooth, practiced smile. "Linda has told us so many wonderful things about Bethany. We have always admired how your daughter has persevered despite her difficult beginnings. My parents and I were just saying how remarkable she is." I stared at Preston. My jaw nearly dropped. He had sat there laughing when Linda humiliated me. He had watched Ashley break the glass with a look of pure amusement. Now he was desperately backpedaling, trying to secure favor with a man whose wealth dwarfed his own family's fortune. The hypocrisy in the room was so thick, it was suffocating. They were all scrambling, rearranging their alliances, bowing down to the power of Harrison's name. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell Harrison the truth right then and there. I wanted to yell that Linda was garnishing my wages, that Ashley treated me like a servant, that this entire display of family affection was a disgusting, self-serving illusion. My heart pounded against my ribs, urging me to expose them. But the lifelong fear of Linda's retaliation held my tongue. She still held the medical debt over me. She still had the power to ruin my credit, take my apartment, and destroy the small life I had managed to build. I looked down at the restaurant floor, feeling completely overwhelmed by the sudden collision of my past and my present. Harrison did not acknowledge Preston. He did not acknowledge Ashley's fake embrace. He simply reached out and gently removed Ashley's arm from my shoulders. He stepped between us, placing himself as a physical barrier between me and the people who had tormented me. He looked down at me, his expression softening into something incredibly tender and protective. "I will not leave you here with them," Harrison said, his voice firm and unwavering. "You are coming with me right now." The panic instantly set in. I could not just walk out. I was on the clock. I owed Linda money. I looked up at him, tears finally pooling in my eyes. "I cannot," I whispered, terrified of the consequences. "I will lose my job. I owe her too much money. She will ruin me." Harrison's eyes darkened with a furious protective rage. He looked back at Linda, his jaw set like granite. Then he looked at me and said words I will never forget. "You owe them nothing, and they are about to lose absolutely everything." I stood frozen, realizing that my life was about to change forever. The nightmare was ending, and the reckoning for my toxic family was finally about to begin. Harrison's promise hung in the silent air of the restaurant, a heavy declaration that should have terrified my aunt and cousin. Instead, Ashley saw only dollar signs. The sheer gravity of Harrison Thorne's presence, the bespoke suit, the solid gold pen, the unmistakable aura of a man who owned skyscrapers, completely blinded her to the fury radiating from his gray eyes. She did not hear a threat. She heard an opportunity. She heard a cash register opening. Ashley let out a high and artificial laugh that grated against my ears. She stepped forward with alarming speed, physically wedging her body between Harrison and me. She threw her hip back intentionally, shoving me out of the way. I stumbled backward, my work shoes sliding on the damp floor where the wine had spilled, just barely catching my balance against the edge of a serving station. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, you must be so very overwhelmed by all this sudden emotion," Ashley said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet, practiced charm. She batted her eyelashes and clasped her hands together in a gesture of pure manufactured innocence. "Let me formally introduce myself. I am Ashley. I am Bethany's cousin, but honestly, we are more like identical twins. My mother and I have practically raised her together since she was a little girl. We have given her everything. I stared at her back in total disbelief. Raised me. Ashley was only 3 years older than me. Growing up, she had treated me like a punching bag, forcing me to do her chores and locking me out of her lavish birthday parties. Now she was desperately trying to paint herself as a maternal and saintly figure who had lovingly nurtured me through a life of hardship. Ashley reached out and boldly placed her manicured hand on the sleeve of Harrison's suit jacket. We have always been so incredibly close, she continued, completely ignoring the way Harrison's jaw tightened at her touch. When Aunt Elaine passed away, Bethany was completely shattered. She has always been so incredibly fragile, Mr. Thorne. So delicate. She really cannot handle the pressures of the real world. That is exactly why she works here as a humble server. We encourage her to keep a simple, low-stress job so she does not get overwhelmed and have another one of her little episodes. The sheer audacity of her lies made my blood boil hot in my veins. A little episode. She was framing my exhaustion from working 80-hour weeks to pay off Linda's fraudulent medical debt as a mental deficiency. She was trying to convince a billionaire that I was a broken, incompetent child who needed my saintly cousin to survive. I stepped forward, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. I refused to let her steal my narrative right in front of the father I had just found. That is an absolute lie, I said, my voice shaking with a strong mixture of raw anger and adrenaline. I do not work here because I am fragile. I work here because you and your mother forced me to pay Bethany. Shut your mouth this instant. The sharp, vicious command cracked like a whip across the dining room. Aunt Linda lunged forward, moving with a predatory speed that terrified me. She grabbed my upper arm, her long acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my uniform. She yanked me backward, physically dragging me away from Harrison and pulling me back into her shadow. Her tight grip was a punishing, violent warning. "Do not mind her, Mr. Thorne," Linda said, her voice completely changing as she turned back to Harrison. She smoothed her features into an expression of deep, tragic concern, playing the role of the long-suffering guardian to absolute perfection. She gets very confused when she is highly emotional. It is a tragedy, really. We do our absolute best to safely manage her outbursts, but sometimes she just loses her firm grip on reality. Linda squeezed my arm tighter, making me wince in pain. I tried to pull away, but her fingers were locked around my bicep like a strong steel vise. She was establishing dominance physically, demonstrating to Harrison that she controlled me. She wanted him to see that I was entirely dependent on her, a helpless burden that she bravely managed day after day. Elaine's passing completely broke the poor girl's mind. Linda continued, shaking her head sadly. She has never been the same since. We have spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to get her the proper psychological help. We have sacrificed our comfort to make sure she has a roof over her head. If we had not quickly stepped in, she would be out on the cold city streets. We protect her from herself, Mr. Thorne. She is completely reliant on our charity. I felt a cold wave of despair wash over me. Linda was weaving a suffocating web of lies. She was using the trauma she inflicted upon me to prove I was unstable. She knew if she painted me as dependent, Harrison would have to negotiate directly with her. She was positioning herself as the gatekeeper to my well-being. Preston's wealthy family nodded in sympathetic agreement. They were buying every word of Linda's masterful performance. Ashley chimed in again, stepping closer to Harrison to ensure she remained the center of his attention. It is a massive burden, Mr. Thorne, but we do it out of pure love. Family is family after all. And now that you are here, we can finally share that responsibility. We can work together to make sure Bethany is taken care of. My mother and I have experience handling her unique needs. We could consult with your team, maybe set up a special care arrangement. We just want what is best for our sweet, fragile girl. Ashley was already laying the groundwork for a massive financial payout. She was trying to quickly secure a permanent consulting position in my life, ensuring that Harrison's wealth would flow directly through her hands. She wanted to turn my existence into a lucrative, lifelong career for herself. I looked at Harrison, desperate for him to see through their toxic charade. He stood completely silent, his stormy gray eyes absorbing every single detail of the interaction. He looked at Ashley's greedy, desperate smile. He looked at Linda's tight, punishing grip on my arm. He saw my pale face and the quiet, ingrained terror in my posture. He was a sharp man who built vast empires by reading people, by understanding the hidden motives behind every boardroom smile and corporate handshake. Harrison did not say a word to Ashley. He did not acknowledge her fake affection or her obvious attempts to charm him. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp white linen handkerchief. He slowly wiped a stray drop of spilled wine from his hand, his movements deliberate and terrifyingly calm. Then he dropped the handkerchief directly onto the sharp shattered crystal on the dining floor. "Take your hand off my daughter," Harrison said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a dark, lethal authority that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Linda blinked, caught completely off guard by the sheer hostility in his tone. She loosened her tight grip slightly, but she did not let go. "Mr. Thorne, you simply do not understand the situation. She needs constant supervision. She is not capable of making rational decisions for herself." "I said take your hand off her now," Harrison repeated, taking a slow, menacing step toward Linda. "If you do not remove your fingers from her arm in the next 2 seconds, I will have my security team remove them for you. And I promise you they will not be gentle." Linda gasped, finally dropping her hand as if she had been burned. She stumbled back a single step, colliding with Ashley. The arrogant, controlling matriarch was suddenly faced with a predator much larger and far more dangerous than herself. Harrison stepped up to me. He gently placed his hands on my shoulders, his touch incredibly warm and reassuring compared to Linda's violent grip. "You are a terrible liar," Linda Harrison said, not taking his eyes off me. "I can see the fear in her eyes. I can see the bruises you leave behind. You have not protected her. You have imprisoned her, and that absolutely ends tonight." He turned his body, slightly shielding me completely from their view. "Bethany, you are leaving this establishment with me right now. You are walking out those front doors and you are never coming back to this miserable place. You will never serve another drink and you will never cower in front of these parasites again. We are leaving now." My heart leapt with a sudden desperate hope. I wanted nothing more than to walk out into the cool Chicago night with him. I wanted to leave the spilled wine, the broken glass, and the years of agonizing abuse far behind me. I took a small step forward, ready to follow him anywhere. But Linda was not finished. The realization that her lifelong punching bag, her ultimate source of control and income, was about to quickly walk out the door, pushed her into a state of sheer panic. She could see the billions of dollars slipping through her fingers. She could see her authority dissolving into dust. Linda lunged forward and physically blocked the narrow aisle between the dining tables. She stood squarely in Harrison's path, her arms crossed over her chest, her face twisting into an ugly and triumphant sneer. She had lost the battle of intimidation, but she was fully prepared to start a war. "You are not taking her anywhere," Harrison, Linda said, her voice rising to a shrill, commanding pitch. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a dark, malicious certainty. She was preparing to drop the ultimate anchor, the heavy, suffocating chain that had kept me bound to her for my entire adult life. She was getting ready to finally play her absolute trump card. Linda planted her feet firmly on the hardwood floor, her expensive heels digging in as if anchoring her to the very foundation of the restaurant. She crossed her arms over her chest, the diamonds on her wrists catching the harsh light of the chandeliers. She looked up at Harrison Thorne with a predatory gleam in her eyes. "You are not taking her anywhere," she stated, her voice echoing with absolute venom. "You think you can just walk in here after 33 years and play the hero? You think your billions erase the fact that she belongs to me? She owes me her entire life, and more importantly, she owes me a massive fortune." Harrison did not flinch. He looked at Linda as if she were a minor inconvenience, a pest that needed to be swatted away. "She belongs to no one," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She is a grown woman and my daughter. She is walking out that door with me." "She is walking nowhere," Linda spat. "Your daughter is drowning in a $60,000 legal debt. When her mother died, she left behind astronomical hospice bills. I took on that debt. I paid for Elaine's care when you were busy building your empire. I have the signed contracts. Bethany is legally obligated to repay every cent, and she is nowhere close to finishing. If she walks out and loses this job, I will have her wages garnished. I will have the authorities drag her into court. She will end up in a jail cell. I felt the blood drain from my face. The sheer terror of Linda's words paralyzed me. This was the exact nightmare I had lived with since I was a teenager. The constant suffocating fear of the debt. It was the chain that kept me bound to her, the weapon she used to crush any hope of freedom I ever dared to entertain. I looked at Harrison, desperate to see if he understood the gravity of the situation, but I was too ashamed to speak. I was a 33-year-old woman trapped in a cage of poverty, and I felt entirely pathetic in front of the father I had just met. Ashley stepped up right beside her mother, her arms crossed in an identical posture of arrogant superiority. "It is true," Mr. Thorne. Ashley chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Bethany is incredibly financially unstable. She has absolutely no savings, no assets, and terrible credit. She cannot even afford to buy groceries without my mother's charity. She is deeply emotionally fragile, completely incapable of managing her own life. If you take her away from our careful supervision, she will completely fall apart. We are the only ones keeping her from total ruin." Preston and his wealthy family watched with blatant disgust, horrified to be associated with such an impoverished spectacle. The restaurant manager hovered near the kitchen doors, terrified to intervene, but worried about the scene unfolding in his elite dining room. Harrison remained entirely unmoved by their theatrics. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders squared against their combined hostility. "I will write you a check for $60,000 right now," Harrison said, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "I will write it for double that amount if it means I never have to look at your face again. Name your price, Linda. Name the price for my daughter's freedom, and I will pay it before I leave this building." Linda smiled, a slow, malicious stretching of her lips. She had been waiting for this exact moment. She had baited the trap perfectly. "Oh, Harrison, you think this is just about a simple medical bill?" Linda said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet restaurant. "You think you can just throw your pocket change at me and walk away with a clean conscience? That is not how this works. You owe me for 33 years of backbreaking child support. You owe me for the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the burden of raising the bastard child of a billionaire who was too cowardly to stand by the woman he loved." Harrison took a step forward, the sheer force of his anger radiating from his body. "Do not push me, Linda." Linda stood her ground, fueled by a mixture of greed and desperate arrogance. "Do not threaten me," she shot back. "You are a public figure, Harrison Thorne. You are the CEO of a global empire. You have shareholders, a board of directors, and a pristine corporate image to maintain. How do you think the Chicago press will react when I call them tonight? How will the morning papers read when I tell them the great Harrison Thorne abandoned his pregnant girlfriend to die in poverty? How will your investors feel when they learn you left your only daughter to starve, forcing her to serve drinks to the elite while you flew around in private jets?" The threat hung heavily in the air, toxic and devastating. Linda was completely unhinged. She was willing to destroy Harrison's entire life's work, his reputation, and his legacy, just to extort a massive fortune from him. "I will give exclusive interviews to every gossip rag and news station in the city." Linda continued, her eyes wide with manic excitement. "I will show them the medical bills. I will show them the squalid apartment Bethany lives in. I will paint you as the most ruthless, heartless monster in corporate America. Your stock prices will plummet. Your legacy will be absolute garbage. Unless, of course, you compensate me properly for my silence and my decades of maternal sacrifice." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The room started to spin. I could not let this happen. I had spent my entire life suffering under Linda's control, and I knew exactly how vicious and relentless she could be. She was an absolute master at twisting the truth and destroying people's lives. I could not let her destroy Harrison. He had only just found out I was alive. He had looked at me with such profound grief and love. I could not let my existence be the weapon that tore down his entire empire. More importantly, the panic regarding my own secret life threatened to choke me. If Linda brought the press into this, my secret catering business would be exposed. The LLC I had worked so desperately to build over the last 5 years would be uncovered. Linda would realize I had hidden income. She would sue me for everything I had built, claiming I defrauded her regarding the debt. She would take my business, my money, and my freedom. I would end up in a real prison. The deep psychological conditioning of 33 years of abuse suddenly kicked in with overwhelming force. The survival instinct that told me to submit, to comply, to beg for mercy, took complete control of my body. I could not fight her right now. The stakes were far too high, and we were completely unprepared for the depth of her malice. I stepped out from behind Harrison. I reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket. My hands were shaking uncontrollably and my voice cracked as I spoke. Please, I begged him, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. Please just stop. You have to stop. Harrison turned to look at me, his intense gray eyes softening instantly. Bethany, you do not have to be afraid of her anymore, he said softly, reaching up to gently cup my face. I have more lawyers and resources than she can even comprehend. I will crush her. I will protect you. I shook my head frantically, stepping back from his warm touch. You do not understand what she is capable of. I whispered, my voice thick with terror. She will destroy everything. She will ruin your company, and she will ruin my life. She will have me thrown in jail for the debt. Please, sir. Please just walk away. I cannot lose my job tonight. I cannot afford the consequences of this fight. Just leave. Harrison stared at me, the heartbreak visible in every line of his face. He saw the sheer panic in my eyes. He saw the way I cowered away from Linda, my shoulders hunched in submission. He was a brilliant strategist, a man who knew when to attack and when to pull back. He realized that forcing me to leave with him right now would only cause more trauma. He saw my fear of Linda was too deeply ingrained to be broken in a single night. He knew he had to play the long game to ensure my safety and guarantee Linda's total destruction. He slowly lowered his hands, a muscle feathering in his clenched jaw. He looked back at Linda, his expression turning into a mask of pure glacial ice. You have won nothing tonight, Linda Harrison stated, his voice a quiet, terrifying promise of absolute ruin. Enjoy your dinner. It will be the most expensive meal of your miserable life. Linda smirked clearly, believing she had won the ultimate victory. She crossed her arms, looking smug and untouchable, while Ashley beamed with arrogant pride. They thought they had successfully subdued the billionaire and kept their favorite punching bag firmly in her place. Harrison turned his back on them. He looked down at me one last time. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. He reached out and gently took my trembling hand. He pressed the heavy card into my palm, folding my fingers over it. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive cologne and clean rain surrounding me. He pressed his lips to my forehead, a tender fatherly gesture that made my heart ache with a desperate longing I had never known before. He pulled back slightly and looked deeply into my tear-filled eyes. I will not lose you twice, he whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute, unshakable conviction. He let go of my hand, turned on his heel, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving me standing in the wreckage of the evening, clutching the only key to my future tightly in my hand. The rest of my shift was a blur of adrenaline and paralyzing anxiety. Linda and Ashley had stormed out shortly after Harrison left, leaving the $800 bill unpaid. The restaurant manager, furious but terrified of Linda's connections, forced me to cover it out of my own pocket, draining the last few dollars I had to my name. I did not care. My fingers remained tightly curled around the matte black business card Harrison Thorne had pressed into my palm. It felt like a beacon of light in the suffocating darkness I had endured for 33 years. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat on the edge of my worn mattress, staring at the 10-digit private number embossed in silver ink. At exactly 7 in the morning, I finally gathered the courage to make the call. The voice on the other end was not Harrison, but a crisp professional assistant who immediately provided an address for a quiet, secluded coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. She told me Mr. Thorne was already waiting. When I arrived at the designated location, the cafe was entirely empty of regular patrons. Harrison had apparently bought out the entire establishment for the morning, ensuring absolute privacy. He sat in a plush leather booth at the very back of the room. He was not alone. Flanking him were three men in impeccably tailored suits, who radiated the sharp, calculating energy of high-powered corporate attorneys. Harrison stood up immediately the moment the bell above the door chimed. The relief that washed over his face when he saw me walk through the door was profound and undeniable. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night pacing the floor, terrified I would disappear back into the shadows of Linda's control. He guided me to the booth, pulling out a chair for me with a gentle, protective respect I had never experienced. He introduced the men beside him as his elite personal legal counsel. The lead attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Sterling, placed a thick, pristine folder on the wooden table. Harrison leaned forward, his gray eyes locked onto mine, filled with a desperate, urgent sincerity. "Bethany," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I have spent the last 12 hours mobilizing every single resource at my disposal. I have a secure luxury penthouse ready for you right now. I have a blank check waiting for your signature. I will assign a 24-hour private security detail to ensure Linda can never come within 100 feet of you again. You never have to go back to that restaurant. You never have to serve another drink. I will completely eradicate that woman from your life and give you the world you were always meant to have." His offer was a dazzling, intoxicating fantasy. It was the ultimate rescue, the fairy tale ending every abused child secretly prays for in the dark. He was offering to instantly wipe away my pain with his limitless billions, to shield me behind walls of impenetrable wealth. But as I looked at the blank check resting on the table, a strange, powerful calm washed over my entire body. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused and scarred from years of brutal physical labor, but they were also incredibly strong. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a fundamental shift in the power dynamic of the room. I was not a helpless princess waiting in a tower, and I was entirely done pretending to be one. I reached out and gently pushed the blank check back across the table toward him. I watched the utter confusion blossom on his face and the subtle surprise register in the eyes of his highly paid lawyers. "I do not want your money, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and clear, ringing with a newfound authority that surprised even me. "I appreciate your fierce desire to protect me. I truly do. It is the first time in my life anyone has ever offered me a genuine safety net. But I do not need you to buy my freedom. I do not need you to rescue me financially. I only need your help to destroy her completely and permanently on my own terms." Harrison frowned, leaning back slightly in his leather seat. "Bethany, you do not have to be brave right now. You are drowning in a $60,000 debt to a woman who uses it to keep you enslaved. You work grueling double shifts just to survive. You have absolutely nothing. Let me take this burden away from you." I smiled, a slow, sharp smile that felt completely foreign on my lips. "That is exactly what Linda thinks," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the wooden table. "That is what Ashley thinks. That is what I have carefully, meticulously allowed them to believe for the past 5 years. But it is an absolute lie." The three lawyers exchanged swift, calculating glances. Harrison narrowed his eyes, his brilliant business mind instantly picking up on the radical shift in my demeanor. "What exactly are you saying, Bethany?" he asked, his tone dropping into a serious analytical register. I took another deep breath, preparing to finally speak the truth I had guarded with my life. "I am not just a broke, desperate waitress," I revealed, the words tasting like sweet victory on my tongue. "When Linda forced me to drop out of community college and take that awful restaurant job to pay her back, I realized I would never escape if I played by her rules. I knew she would monitor every single penny I made on paper. She demanded to see my pay stubs. She legally garnished my W-2 wages directly from the restaurant. She kept me mathematically trapped exactly at the poverty line so I could never afford a lawyer or a way out. I paused, letting the reality of my survival sink into the minds of the men sitting across from me. But she made one massive critical mistake. I continued. She thought I was stupid. She thought I was a broken, worthless charity case who had no ambition or talent. She completely underestimated my drive to survive. 5 years ago, I took the tiny fraction of cash tips I managed to hide from her, and I started cooking in my tiny studio apartment. I started baking and preparing small, elegant meals for local corporate luncheons. I worked 20 hours a day. I served VIP tables at the restaurant until midnight, then went home and cooked until dawn. I built a client list through sheer relentless grit. I reinvested every single dollar I earned right back into the business. 3 years ago, I officially incorporated an LLC, using a registered agent service to completely shield my identity as the primary owner. Harrison stared at me, his jaw slightly slack with pure, unfiltered astonishment. The billionaire titan of industry was sitting across from his daughter, completely mesmerized by her sheer entrepreneurial ruthlessness. I own an elite high-end private catering and event management company, I declared, holding my head high. We cater exclusively to Chicago's upper crust. Corporate galas, charity balls, luxury weddings. We employ a full staff of 30 incredible professionals. My business generates millions in revenue every single year. My shielded corporate accounts are exceptionally healthy. I am not starving, Harrison. I am a highly successful chief executive officer. I am exactly like you. The silence in the coffee shop was absolute. The lead attorney Sterling actually let out a low, impressed whistle under his breath. Harrison looked like a man who had just struck gold in a barren desert. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his handsome face. The immense pride radiating from his gray eyes was so powerful it made my chest ache. He let out a breathless, stunned laugh, shaking his head in pure wonder. "If you own a multi-million-dollar catering empire," Harrison asked, his voice laced with profound respect, "then why on earth are you still breaking your back waiting tables at Lumiere? Why let Linda humiliate you night after night? Why pretend to be a penniless servant?" Because of the medical debt, I explained the bitter reality, returning to temper my triumph. Linda holds a legally binding contract that I was forced to sign on my 18th birthday. It dictates that she has the absolute right to garnish my primary wages to pay off the $60,000 she supposedly spent on my mother's hospice care. If I quit the restaurant job and declare my LLC income, she will instantly come after my business. She will sue me for fraud, claiming I hid assets to avoid paying the debt. She will use her high-powered country club lawyers to seize my company, my corporate accounts, and everything I have built from the ground up. I looked down at the table, my hands clenching back into tight fists. I kept the waitressing job because it provided a highly visible, taxable income for her to garnish. It fed her greed and kept her completely blind to my real life. I let her take my meager restaurant paychecks so she would never go digging into my private financial records. I endure the abuse and the humiliation because it is the ultimate camouflage. It protects my empire. I was waiting to save enough liquid cash offshore to hire a ruthless legal team to fight the debt contract, but her grip on the local courts is terrifyingly strong. Sterling, the lead attorney, suddenly leaned forward, his elbows hitting the table. His sharp, predatory eyes locked onto mine. The seasoned corporate lawyer smelled blood in the water. "Miss Thorne," Sterling said, deliberately using Harrison's last name, a subtle validation that sent a thrill down my spine. "You mentioned that this $60,000 debt stems specifically from your mother's end-of-life hospice care. You stated that your Aunt Linda claims she paid these medical bills entirely out of her own pocket 33 years ago." "Yes," I confirmed, nodding slowly. "She reminds me of her incredible sacrifice every single day. She has a massive stack of aged hospital invoices and promissory notes she waves in my face whenever I dare to question the payments. She says my mother died completely penniless and left me as a massive financial burden." Sterling exchanged a very fast, very dark look with Harrison. The temperature in the booth seemed to plummet. The billionaire and his legal shark were communicating silently, putting pieces of a massive puzzle together at lightning speed. Sterling reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad, clicking his silver pen. Miss Thorne, Sterling said, his voice dropping into a deadly serious investigative tone. I need you to grant my forensic accounting team immediate authorization to access those specific debt documents. I need to see the original contracts, the hospital invoices, and the exact garnishment orders your aunt filed with the local courts. Why, I asked, my heart skipping a sudden nervous beat. Is there a way to break the garnishment contract legally? Sterling did not smile. His expression was grim and highly focused. We are not just going to break the contract, Miss Thorne. He looked over at Harrison, whose gray eyes were now burning with a cold, lethal fury. Based on what your father just told me about his financial arrangements 33 years ago, Sterling stated, his voice cutting through the quiet cafe like a razor blade, I highly suspect those medical debt documents are completely fraudulent. I believe your Aunt Linda has orchestrated a massive criminal cover-up. Something in her financial history does not add up at all, and I strongly suspect severe foul play. The next morning, I met Harrison and his legal team at an entirely different location. This time, we gathered in a sleek, hyper-modern conference room at the very top of his corporate headquarters. The massive glass windows offered a panoramic view of the entire Chicago skyline. It was a breathtaking symbol of his immense power. Sterling, the lead attorney, sat at the head of the large mahogany table. He had two other forensic accountants sitting beside him. Their laptops were open and multiple thick files were spread out across the polished wood. Harrison sat right next to me. He poured me a cup of coffee himself, his movements tight and controlled. I could feel the suppressed fury radiating from him. He had not slept either. We have spent the last 14 hours conducting a deep dive into your aunt's financial history. Sterling began adjusting his glasses. Miss Thorne, what I am about to show you is going to be incredibly difficult to hear. I need you to understand that you have been the victim of a highly sophisticated criminal operation for your entire life. Sterling turned his laptop screen toward me. He clicked to display a scanned image of an old banking document. It was dated 33 years ago, exactly 1 month before I was born. When your father realized Elaine had disappeared, Sterling explained, his voice dropping into a clinical, objective tone, he immediately set up a blind trust. He could not locate her physically, but he knew her social security number and her banking details. He transferred exactly $2 million into a secure account exclusively in her name. He structured it so the funds could only be accessed for her medical care, housing, and eventually for the care of any child she might have. I stared at the black and white numbers on the screen. $2 million. I felt all the air leave my lungs. I thought about the tiny, freezing apartment my mother and I had lived in. I thought about her working 2 jobs until she physically collapsed. I thought about the days we ate plain rice because we could not afford groceries. She never knew, I whispered, my voice cracking. My mother never knew about this money. Harrison closed his eyes tightly, his jaw working. No, she did not. He said, his voice thick with a profound, devastating grief. The trust was entirely blind. The bank was instructed to notify her, but based on the paper trail we found, your aunt intercepted that notification. Sterling clicked to the next slide. It showed a series of complex wire transfers and highly suspicious legal documents. When Elaine became terminally ill, she was completely incapacitated. Sterling continued. Linda stepped in as her primary caregiver. Linda found the notification from the bank regarding the blind trust. Instead of telling your mother, Linda forged Elaine's signature on a series of power of attorney documents. I felt physically sick. The pieces were locking into place, forming a horrifying picture. Linda used those forged documents to completely drain the $2 million trust, Sterling stated, tapping his pen against the table. She systematically moved the funds through several shell accounts to hide the origin. She used that stolen money to purchase the massive luxury home she currently lives in. She used it to fund Ashley's expensive private school education. She used it to buy designer clothes, luxury cars, and country club memberships. She built her entire affluent lifestyle on the money your father left to protect you and your mother. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears. The sheer scale of the betrayal was paralyzing. Every single time Ashley had mocked my cheap clothes, she was wearing clothes bought with my money. Every time Linda had bragged about her successful investments, she was bragging about the fortune she had stolen from a dying woman. But what about the debt? I asked, my voice trembling with raw fury. Why did she force me to sign that garnishment contract when I turned 18? If she already had the $2 million, why keep me trapped? Sterling's expression hardened into pure disgust. Because she is a sociopath, Miss Thorne. She needed a way to explain the hospice bills if anyone ever audited the estate. She paid the hospital using the stolen trust money, but she kept the invoices. When you turned 18, she presented those invoices to you claiming she paid them out of her own pocket. She forced you to sign that debt contract under extreme duress, threatening to throw you out on the street. She did not just steal your money, Bethany Harrison said, leaning close to me, his voice shaking with a terrifying, lethal rage. She stole your freedom. She kept you impoverished and exhausted so you would never have the time, energy, or resources to investigate her. She used that fake debt to keep you perfectly enslaved while she lived like a queen on my money. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, completely numb. 33 years of poverty. 33 years of brutal, exhausting labor. 33 years of believing I was an unwanted burden, a charity case, a failure. It was all a meticulously manufactured prison. Linda had constructed a cage of lies and locked me inside, dropping the key into her own bank account. We have more than enough evidence to go to the FBI right now, Sterling advised, closing his laptop with a sharp snap. We can have her arrested for wire fraud, embezzlement, and severe financial abuse of a vulnerable adult. She will face decades in federal prison. I looked at the files on the table. I thought about Linda sitting in her country club, sipping expensive wine and laughing about my pathetic life. I thought about Ashley tossing that champagne glass on the floor, forcing me to my knees. A slow, dark anger began to burn in my chest. It was not the panicked, helpless anger of a victim. It was the cold, calculating fury of a survivor who suddenly held all the cards. No, I said quietly. Harrison looked at me, surprised. Bethany, she belongs in a cell. She needs to be arrested immediately. I turned to look at my father. I saw the same ruthless business instinct in his eyes that I felt activating in my own mind. If we call the police now, she gets to hide behind her lawyers. I explained, my voice steady and cold. She will post bail using my stolen money. She will spin some lie to the press about a tragic misunderstanding. She will play the victim. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the polished mahogany table. I do not just want her to go to prison, Harrison. I want her to lose absolutely everything. I want her completely stripped of her social standing, her reputation, and her fake wealthy facade. I want her destroyed publicly in front of every single person she has ever tried to impress. Sterling raised an eyebrow, a slow, dangerous smile appearing on his face. He recognized the strategy. The corporate shark appreciated the sheer brutality of my plan. What exactly are you proposing? Miss Thorne, Sterling asked, leaning in. Ashley's wedding is in exactly 3 weeks, I said, the plan forming perfectly in my mind. Linda has been bragging about it for months. She is obsessed with showing off to Preston's elite family. She has invited 300 of the wealthiest people in Chicago. She wants it to be the social event of the year. I looked directly at Harrison. Linda and Ashley believe you are just a guilty, easily manipulated father. They think you are desperate to buy my affection and keep them quiet. I want you to let them think exactly that. I want you to walk right into their trap. Harrison's eyes gleamed with a sudden dark understanding. You want me to fund the wedding? Yes, I said, nodding slowly. I want you to agree to pay for the entire extravagant $300,000 event, but you are going to attach one strict, non-negotiable condition. You will only write the check if they agree to use a specific, highly elite private event management company, a company you personally trust. Harrison let out a low, sharp laugh. He saw the brilliant, absolute perfection of the trap. And that company is your LLC. I smiled, feeling the true power of my hidden empire for the first time. Exactly. They will eagerly sign the binding vendor contracts because they think they are getting a massive free ride. They will be entirely unaware that they just hired my company to run the most important night of their lives. I will control every single aspect of that wedding from the shadows. And then, Sterling concluded, catching the devastating finale, we drop the legal hammer at the reception. We wait until she is standing in front of 300 elite guests, thinking she has won everything. And we take it all away. I finished, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. We expose the stolen trust fund. We serve the FBI indictment. We hand her the bill for the entire wedding, and we leave her completely bankrupt in front of her new wealthy in-laws. Harrison reached out and gripped my hand tightly. His eyes were burning with a fierce, overwhelming pride. He was looking at his daughter, and he saw a queen preparing for war. Sterling Harrison commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Draft the vendor contracts immediately. Make them ironclad. Tie every single financial liability directly to Linda's personal assets. We are going to give them the wedding of the century, Harrison said, looking at me with a lethal protective smile. And it will be the very last party they ever attend. 2 days later, Linda and Ashley strutted through the massive revolving glass doors of Thorne Industries in downtown Chicago. They moved with the aggressive entitlement of women who believed they had just won the ultimate lottery. Ashley wore a brand new designer coat entirely funded by the stolen trust money, while Linda carried herself like a conquering queen, inspecting her new castle. They completely ignored the polite greetings of the lobby staff, demanding immediate access to the executive floor. They believed Harrison Thorne was terrified of them. They were absolutely convinced that their blackmail threat in the restaurant had successfully cornered a global billionaire and brought him to his knees. They stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor. The doors opened to reveal a massive reception area lined with imported Italian marble and striking modern art. Harrison's executive assistant, a highly trained professional named Claire, intercepted them immediately. She politely asked if they had an appointment. Linda merely scoffed, waving her hand dismissively in Claire's face. She loudly proclaimed that they did not need an appointment to see family and demanded Claire step aside immediately. Claire, having been thoroughly briefed by Sterling on exactly how to handle these specific intruders, put on a flawless mask of apologetic deference. She nodded respectfully and escorted them directly into Harrison's private corner office. Harrison sat behind a massive desk carved from solid mahogany. He looked up from a stack of complex financial reports, his expression carefully arranged to project a mixture of deep exhaustion and reluctant submission. It was a masterful performance. He looked exactly like a man who realized he was completely trapped by his own past mistakes. Linda took a seat without waiting for an invitation, crossing her legs and looking around the opulent office with greedy, evaluating eyes. She noted the expensive artwork and the breathtaking view of the city skyline, calculating exactly how much she could extract from him. Ashley took the plush leather chair next to her mother, pulling out her smartphone to take a quick selfie with the incredible view behind her. "We do not have a lot of time, Harrison." Linda started, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy and thinly veiled threats. "We are incredibly busy preparing for Ashley's wedding. It is in exactly 3 weeks, and the stress of managing a high society event while also protecting your delicate, fragile daughter is taking a severe toll on my health. We came here today to discuss a practical, permanent solution to our ongoing arrangement regarding Bethany." Harrison folded his hands together, resting them deliberately on his desk. He maintained perfect, unblinking eye contact, projecting the exact image of a defeated father, desperate to keep his darkest secrets buried from his corporate board. "What exactly are you proposing, Linda?" he asked, his tone flat and carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Ashley leaned forward, placing her manicured hands flat on the mahogany surface. "My wedding is the social event of the season, Mr. Thorne," she said, her eyes gleaming with undisguised greed. "We have invited 300 of the most influential and wealthy people in Chicago. Preston's family expects absolute flawless perfection. But frankly, dealing with the emotional fallout of your sudden reappearance has severely impacted our wedding budget. We believe it is only fair that you step up and fulfill your financial obligations to our family. We consider it a necessary gesture of good faith to prove you actually care about Bethany's continued well-being. And what is the exact price of this good faith gesture? Harrison asked, not a single muscle twitching in his face. $300,000, Linda stated boldly. Not a single trace of hesitation in her demanding voice. We need $300,000 transferred to my personal checking account by tomorrow morning to cover the remaining vendor balances, the luxury catering, and the premium floral arrangements. If you cover this minor expense, we will ensure Bethany remains quiet and safely tucked away. We will continue to protect your pristine corporate reputation from the nasty, brutal realities of your past mistakes. We consider it a massive bargain for your continued public standing. Harrison let a long, heavy, suffocating silence fill the large office. He looked down at his desk, his broad shoulders slumping slightly forward. He played the part of the extorted victim with terrifying accuracy. He knew exactly what Linda and Ashley needed to see to feel completely victorious. He let out a deep, weary sigh, rubbing his temples as if fighting a massive stress-induced headache. $300,000 is a significant amount of liquid capital to move without alerting my board of directors. Harrison said, his voice carrying a slight manufactured tremor of anxiety. If I write a check of that magnitude directly to your personal account, my financial compliance team will immediately flag the transaction. They will demand to know why I am transferring corporate funds to a woman I have not seen in 33 years. It will trigger the exact forensic investigation you are actively threatening me with right now. Linda frowned, her arrogant posture stiffening in her chair. That sounds like a personal problem, Harrison. I am sure a man of your vast resources can figure out how to hide a simple payment. If you cannot, we will be forced to explain the situation to the local press. I am sure the media will find your financial excuses incredibly boring compared to the scandalous headline of your abandoned, starving daughter. They will ruin your legacy before the weekend is over. Harrison held up a hand, asking for calm patience. I am not refusing to pay for the wedding, Linda. Let me be completely clear. I am fully prepared to cover the entire $300,000 cost today. I am simply telling you that we must structure the payment properly to protect both of us from unwanted legal scrutiny and massive tax penalties. Ashley's eyes lit up like vibrant fireworks. You are going to pay for the whole thing? She practically squealed, completely dropping her intimidating act in the face of massive wealth. The thought of a fully funded luxury event erased all her previous hostility. Yes, Harrison confirmed, keeping his face a tight mask of weary defeat. But I cannot hand you raw cash. The only way I can legally authorize a payment of that size without triggering an internal audit is to pay a registered corporate vendor directly. I will fund your entire wedding, but I have one strict, non-negotiable condition. Linda's eyes narrowed suspiciously. She sat up straighter, studying his face for any sign of deception. What is the condition, Harrison? If I am footing a $300,000 bill, Harrison stated, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers, I refuse to let amateur vendors ruin the event. I have a specific elite private event management company that handles all of my high-level corporate galas and private charity functions. They are discreet, incredibly professional, and they know exactly how to invoice my holding company, so the funds clear without any red flags or delays. You will immediately dismiss your current caterers and planners. You will use my trusted company to execute the wedding. They will handle the gourmet food, the serving staff, the logistics, and the venue coordination. I will pay their corporate invoice directly. That is the only way you get the money. Linda and Ashley exchanged a swift, greedy look. They were mentally calculating the massive financial windfall. Getting a billionaire's personal elite event team for absolutely free meant they could quietly pocket whatever budget they had already scraped together from Preston's family. It was an absolute dream scenario for them. A luxury corporate upgrade funded entirely by a man they believed they had successfully blackmailed into submission. Fine, Linda agreed, a triumphant sneer spreading across her face. If your corporate people can handle Preston's elite family standards, we will use your management company. Have your lawyers draw up the vendor guarantee today. We do not have time to waste. Harrison pressed a silver button on his desk phone. Sterling walked into the office mere seconds later, carrying a thick stack of binding legal contracts. The lawyer's face was completely devoid of emotion as he placed the heavy documents on the table. Sterling pointed out the specific signature lines explaining that the contracts clearly stated the event company would take full operational and financial control of the wedding reception logistics. Linda and Ashley did not bother to read the fine print. They were far too blinded by their own arrogant greed to notice the trap snapping shut around them. They eagerly snatched the gold pen Sterling offered and aggressively signed their names to every single page, binding themselves to the terms. They handed the signed contracts back to Sterling, smiling like they had just conquered the entire world. They strutted out of the executive office, dreaming of their perfect luxury wedding, completely and entirely unaware that they had just legally hired Bethany's catering company to control the most important night of their lives. The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding were a masterclass in unhinged arrogance and unchecked greed. Ashley and Linda had walked out of Thorne Industries completely convinced they had successfully extorted a global billionaire. They believed they had secured a limitless fountain of wealth, and they wasted absolutely no time putting that wild delusion to work. The venue they selected for the reception was the Grand Azure Ballroom, which was widely known as one of the most exclusive and outrageously expensive event spaces in downtown Chicago. Under any normal circumstances, they would have been forced to stick to a rigid, strict budget. They would have been carefully monitoring every single floral arrangement and debating the cost of every appetizer choice. But armed with the binding contracts they had so eagerly signed in my father's executive office, they completely lost their minds. Ashley treated the Grand Azure Ballroom like her own personal kingdom, and she treated the event staff like her indentured servants. She strutted through the venue's massive double doors on the very first day of planning, wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors and barking harsh orders before anyone could even greet her. She demanded that the premium silk table linens be entirely replaced immediately because the shade of ivory was slightly too warm for her complexion. When a junior event coordinator politely informed her that importing custom cold ivory silk from Italy would significantly increase the linen budget, Ashley sneered in absolute disgust. She told the young woman that money was no longer an object for her family. She then proceeded to hurl cruel insults at the coordinator's physical appearance, stating that people who bought cheap off-the-rack clothes had absolutely no business advising her on luxury aesthetics. I watched this entire sickening interaction unfold from the absolute safety of the venue's high-tech security and surveillance room. I was physically present on the property, but I was completely unrecognizable. I wore a plain black catering uniform that was deliberately 2 sizes too large to hide my figure. I wore a dark baseball cap pulled low over my forehead and a pair of thick-framed reading glasses. I carried a large wooden clipboard that perfectly shielded the lower half of my face whenever I needed to walk through the busy service corridors. I was no longer Bethany, the terrified, financially trapped waitress. I was the invisible architect of their absolute and total destruction. My senior operations manager, a brilliant and fiercely loyal professional named Greg, served as my direct proxy on the floor. Every single time Ashley threw a massive tantrum and demanded an outrageous luxury upgrade, I gave Greg a specific set of instructions over our secure earpiece communication channel. He would politely apologize for the inconvenience and immediately produce a formal contract amendment for the requested upgrades. This was the most critical and devastating component of our legal trap. The original contract that Harrison had guaranteed completely covered the standard luxury package for 300 guests. However, the fine print, which Linda had aggressively ignored, clearly stated that any excessive upgrades, rush orders, or premium additions demanded directly by the bride or her mother would require secondary financial authorization. Those specific overages would be billed directly to the signing parties and secured against their personal assets. Ashley demanded $50,000 worth of rare, out-of-season white orchids to be flown in directly from South America on a private charter. She claimed the standard roses looked cheap and pathetic. Greg calmly nodded and handed Linda the secondary authorization form. Linda, completely blinded by her own overwhelming greed and believing Harrison was ultimately on the hook for every single penny, signed the document without reading a single word. She aggressively signed her name to a legally binding debt that bypassed my father's corporate accounts entirely. The debt attached itself directly to her stolen $2 million trust fund and the equity of her massive suburban mansion. Over the course of 14 agonizing days, Ashley upgraded the dinner menu to include imported beluga caviar and genuine Wagyu beef. She demanded vintage champagne that cost over $1,000 a single bottle. She insisted on a custom-built crystal canopy to hang over the entire dance floor. With every ridiculous, extravagant demand, Linda blindly signed another ironclad contract amendment. While Ashley was busy terrorizing the catering staff and the floral designers, Linda was actively solidifying her fake social empire. I had my team quietly monitor her activities, and the daily reports they brought back were absolutely nauseating. Linda spent her afternoons lounging at her exclusive country club, holding court among Chicago's wealthy elite. She sat on the expensive veranda, sipping premium martinis and loudly boasting about her newfound unlimited power. She told her wealthy friends that Harrison Thorne, the famously ruthless corporate billionaire, was essentially her personal bank account. She bragged with terrifying arrogance that she held a massive dark secret over his head. She claimed he was so terrified of her power that he was throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars at her just to keep her happy and quiet. She told everyone who would listen that Preston's family was incredibly lucky to be marrying into her bloodline. She was completely unaware that she was publicly confessing to federal extortion in front of high society gossips who would eagerly testify against her when the police inevitably came knocking. The daily abuse my event staff endured from the two women was staggering, but they handled it with absolute professional grace because they knew the ultimate endgame. I had personally briefed my entire team of 30 dedicated employees before the wedding planning even began. I told them the absolute truth about the women they were serving. I explained the stolen trust fund, the fake medical debt, the forged documents, and the years of terrifying psychological abuse I had suffered. My team was fiercely protective of me, and they understood the assignment perfectly. When Ashley screamed at a senior server for not polishing the silver fast enough, calling him a useless, incompetent idiot, the server simply nodded, apologized politely, and walked away with a tight, knowing smile. When Linda snapped her fingers at the lighting technicians, treating them like stray dogs, they remained perfectly calm and completed their work with flawless precision. They endured the relentless insults, the condescending sneers, and the arrogant demands because they knew they were actively participating in the greatest downfall in Chicago high society history. Ashley's behavior grew worse as the wedding day approached. She threw a tasting plate of expensive appetizers directly at a sous chef because the truffle oil was not pungent enough for her refined palate. She threatened to destroy the career of a master pastry chef because the gold leaf on the 7-tier wedding cake was not shimmering the way she wanted. She acted like a billionaire heiress, completely detached from reality and fueled by a bottomless well of unearned entitlement. She paraded through the venue, demanding that the staff drop their eyes when she walked past them. She wanted to feel the rush of absolute subjugation. She wanted to feel like a god. But what Linda and Ashley did not realize was that their monstrous behavior was not just being quietly tolerated. It was being meticulously documented, categorized, and preserved for legal review. Following the strict advice of my father's ruthless legal team, we ensured that every single interaction took place in areas heavily monitored by the venue's state-of-the-art, high-definition security cameras. We captured every thrown plate, every aggressive gesture, and every sneering insult on crystal-clear video. But we went a significant step further than just video surveillance. I personally instructed Greg and the senior event coordinators to carry small digital audio recorders concealed safely in their breast pockets. Every time Ashley threw a screaming fit and demanded an outrageous budget-busting upgrade, the recorders captured it. Every time she insulted a worker's intelligence or threatened their livelihood, the red light blinked silently, preserving the evidence. And every single time Linda casually mentioned holding immense leverage over Harrison Thorne while signing another financially devastating contract amendment, the microphones captured every single syllable of her extortion. My loyal staff never missed a beat. They were actively building a massive, undeniable mountain of evidence that would prevent my aunt and cousin from ever claiming they were confused, manipulated, or misunderstood. The highly trained staff recorded every instance of Ashley and Linda's verbal abuse and extravagant demands, meticulously sealing the lock on the financial cage they were so eagerly building for themselves. The rehearsal dinner took place on the breathtaking outdoor terrace of a historic Chicago estate, just 2 nights before the main event. The evening air was crisp and fragrant, with the scent of thousands of imported white roses that my team had meticulously arranged along the stone balustrades. Crystal string lights hung from the ancient oak trees, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the 50 elite guests in attendance. It was designed to be an intimate gathering primarily meant to introduce Preston's notoriously difficult family to Ashley's supposedly aristocratic background. As the owner of the catering company, I was personally overseeing the entire operation from the shadows. I wore my standard oversized black uniform and kept my baseball cap pulled low. I stood near the edge of the manicured lawn, holding my wooden clipboard, communicating silently with my operations manager, Greg, through our discreet earpieces. We watched as the highly trained service staff circulated with silver trays of champagne and rare caviar appetizers. Everything was executing with absolute military precision. Ashley was draped in a custom silk gown that cost more than my first car. She clung to Preston's arm, laughing too loudly at every comment his father made. Linda was in her absolute element. She floated from group to group, holding a crystal flute of vintage wine, bragging about the spectacular main reception they had planned for Saturday. She spoke about Harrison Thorne as if they were lifelong confidants, casually dropping his name to impress Preston's haughty mother. She painted a picture of immense generational wealth, acting as though my father's billions were essentially her own personal checking account. The sheer arrogance on display was nauseating, but I remained perfectly detached. I watched them gorge themselves on the expensive menu my company had curated, fully aware that every single bite they took was adding another massive digit to the invoice they were about to receive. The financial trap was fully set. Now I just needed to let them tighten the noose around their own necks. Around 9 o'clock, the dinner service transitioned into a cocktail hour. The guests moved from the long banquet tables toward the open bar near the gardens. I decided to do a quick perimeter check of the venue to ensure the valet staff and exterior lighting teams were in position. I stepped away from the busy terrace and walked down a quiet stone pathway that led toward the estate's luxurious guest restrooms. The gardens were completely silent, away from the chatter of the wealthy guests. I took a deep breath of the cool night air, allowing myself a brief moment of calm. I was so close to the finish line. In less than 48 hours, the entire nightmare would be over. Suddenly, I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive heels striking the stone pathway behind me. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who it was. The heavy, suffocating scent of Linda's signature designer perfume washed over me a second later. She had spotted me leaving the terrace and followed me into the shadows. I kept my head down and quickened my pace slightly deliberately, leading her away from the open gardens and toward the isolated restrooms. I knew exactly what she was thinking. Seeing me walking the grounds in my oversized uniform carrying a clipboard, she assumed I was just a pathetic server trying to sneak a break. She probably thought I had come to the rehearsal dinner to grovel to beg Harrison for a handout or to try and ruin her perfect evening with my miserable presence. I reached the heavy oak doors of the women's restroom and stepped inside. The space was opulent, lined with imported Italian marble floor-to-ceiling mirrors and gold-plated fixtures. It was completely empty. The thick stone walls and heavy doors ensured absolute soundproof privacy from the party outside. It was the perfect acoustic environment. I knew Linda was right behind me. I reached into the deep front pocket of my black uniform apron. I pulled out my smartphone, unlocked the screen, and opened my voice recording application. I pressed the red circular button, watching the timer begin to count up. I slid the phone securely back into my pocket, making sure the microphone was completely unobstructed. I took a slow, steadying breath and turned around to face the door just as it swung violently open. Linda marched into the restroom, her face twisted into a mask of pure malicious contempt. She let the heavy oak door slam shut behind her, the sound echoing loudly off the marble walls. She locked the deadbolt with a sharp click, deliberately trapping me inside the room with her. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me, her eyes running up and down my baggy catering uniform with absolute disgust. "What do you think you are doing here, Bethany?" Linda demanded, her voice a harsh, venomous hiss. "Are you spying on us? Are you hoping to catch a glimpse of the life you threw away? Or are you just here to beg your rich daddy for some pocket change while you clear our dirty plates?" I kept my expression perfectly blank. I did not cower. I did not look at the floor. I stood up straight and met her gaze directly. "I am just doing my job, Linda," I said, my voice calm and completely devoid of emotion. "I was hired to make sure this event runs smoothly." Linda let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Your job. You are a pathetic waitress scrubbing toilets and carrying trays because you are too stupid to do anything else." She took a step closer, backing me toward the marble vanity. "But since you are here, we need to have a very serious conversation about your sudden reunion with Harrison Thorne." I remained silent, letting her fill the quiet room with her arrogance. I knew if I just let her speak, she would inevitably hang herself with her own words. "You think you have won something, do you not?" Linda sneered, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You think because Harrison showed up in his expensive suit and played the protective father that you are suddenly safe from me. You think that $60,000 medical debt just magically disappeared. Let me make something absolutely clear to you, Bethany. You are never getting away from me. I own you. I have owned you since the day your worthless mother died, and I will own you until the day you die." I felt a familiar spark of anger flare in my chest, but I ruthlessly suppressed it. I needed her to keep talking. I needed her to feel completely untouchable. "Harrison is currently paying for this entire wedding because I demanded it." Linda continued, pacing back and forth across the marble floor like a triumphant predator. "He is terrified of me. He knows I can destroy his pristine corporate reputation with a single phone call to the Chicago Tribune. He is writing blank checks to keep me quiet, and I'm going to make sure he keeps writing them for the rest of his miserable life." She stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, her eyes burning with unchecked greed. "And that is exactly where you come in, my sweet, fragile niece." I tilted my head slightly, feigning confusion to draw her out further. "What do you mean?" Linda smiled, a dark, predatory stretching of her lips. "Ashley and Preston are going to need a place to live after the honeymoon. A proper luxury estate suited for their new social standing, something in the Gold Coast neighborhood perhaps. But I am not going to ask Harrison for the money. You are." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her demand hang in the air. "You want me to ask Harrison to buy Ashley a house?" "Not just ask Bethany," Linda corrected, her voice dropping into a lethal, threatening register. "You are going to convince your rich daddy to buy Ashley a $5 million house. You are going to cry and tell him it is the only way to heal the rift in our family. You are going to beg him for the money, and you are going to transfer the deed directly to my daughter's name." I let out a slow, deliberate breath. "And what happens if I refuse to extort my father for you? What happens if I tell him exactly what you are trying to do?" Linda stepped so close I could smell the sharp alcohol on her breath. The smug, victorious mask melted away, revealing the absolute monster hiding underneath. She leaned in her face inches from mine and delivered the exact threat I had been waiting for. "If you refuse to get me that money," Linda hissed, every single syllable dripping with venom, "I will destroy you completely. You are going to convince your rich daddy to buy Ashley a $5 million house, or I will show him the fake psych evaluations I kept from your teenage years. I paid a very expensive doctor to document that you suffer from severe violent delusions and paranoid schizophrenia. If you say one word against me, I will hand those files directly to Harrison's corporate lawyers. He will think you are completely insane. He will think you are a danger to yourself and his company. He will lock you in a psychiatric ward and throw away the key just to protect his brand. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life heavily medicated in a padded white room, and I will still get my money." The threat was breathtaking in its cruelty. She had actually manufactured fake medical documents to frame me as a violent schizophrenic. She had kept them hidden for over a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to weaponize my mental health. She was fully prepared to have me institutionalized and stripped of my basic human rights, just to secure a luxury mansion for her golden child. Any normal person would have crumbled under the weight of that psychological terror. The old Bethany, the terrified teenager who lived in constant fear of Linda's wrath, would have fallen to her knees and begged for mercy. She would have promised to do whatever Linda wanted just to avoid being locked away in a psychiatric hospital. But the woman standing in that marble restroom was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar empire. I was a survivor who had built a fortress of wealth and power from absolute scratch. I knew with absolute certainty that her fake medical documents would dissolve into dust the moment Harrison's elite legal team examined them. I looked at the woman who had tormented me for my entire life. I did not cower. I did not cry. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my black uniform apron. My right index finger gently brushed against the warm screen of my smartphone, feeling the recording application capturing every single damning second of her felony extortion. I stayed perfectly calm, ensuring my phone secretly recorded every word of the extortion threat. I looked Linda dead in the eye, my expression a mask of pure, unbothered serenity. "I understand you completely, Linda," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly polite. "You have made your demands exceptionally clear." Linda frowned, clearly unsettled by my lack of panic. She had expected tears, begging, and immediate submission. Instead, she received polite corporate acknowledgement. She stepped back slightly, her confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "Just make sure you get it done," Linda snapped, attempting to regain her dominant posture. "You have until the end of the reception on Saturday. Do not make me ruin your life." I reached out and smoothly unlatched the heavy deadbolt on the oak door. I pulled the door open, letting the sounds of the wealthy guests and the string quartet flood back into the quiet restroom. "I will handle everything exactly as it deserves to be handled, Linda," I said, offering her a small, chilling smile. "Enjoy the rest of your dinner." I turned and walked out of the restroom, leaving her standing alone in the marble space. I did not look back. I walked straight down the stone pathway and back toward the catering kitchen. As soon as I was safely behind the service doors, I pulled my phone from my apron pocket and stopped the recording. I saved the audio file, encrypting it immediately and forwarding a copy directly to Sterling's secure legal server. The trap was no longer just set. The lock had clicked shut, and Linda had just handed me the key to her total and absolute destruction. I slipped my smartphone deep into the pocket of my oversized black apron. The encrypted audio file was securely in the hands of my father's elite legal team. I took a steadying breath and pushed through the heavy swinging doors that led from the service corridor back out to the starlit terrace. The cool evening breeze immediately hit my flushed face, carrying the rich scent of the imported white roses that my floral design team had painstakingly arranged along the stone balconies. The rehearsal dinner was shifting into its final, most crucial social phase. The formal multi-course meal had concluded, and the wealthy guests were now mingling near the custom-built mahogany bars, holding crystal glasses of the $1,000 champagne my aunt had so eagerly ordered on my dime. I adjusted the brim of my baseball cap, ensuring the dark shadows adequately concealed my features, and picked up a silver serving tray to blend in with my staff. I needed to be on the floor. I needed to see exactly how Linda and Ashley were playing their parts in front of Preston's notoriously elitist family. Preston's parents, Charles and Beatrice Kensington, had just arrived from their private flight. They were the absolute epitome of old Chicago money, carrying themselves with a rigid, icy arrogance that demanded immediate deference from everyone in the room. Beatrice wore a severe emerald gown and a heavy diamond necklace that caught the string lights overhead, while Charles surveyed the historic estate with the critical, unyielding gaze of a man accustomed to owning whatever he looked at. Ashley was practically vibrating with desperate, sycophantic energy as she clung to Preston's arm. She nodded frantically at every single word Beatrice spoke, laughing too loudly and trying desperately to mirror the older woman's refined, haughty posture. Linda hovered right beside them, her chest puffed out with manufactured aristocratic pride. She was playing the role of the wealthy, benevolent matriarch to absolute perfection, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire financial empire was about to be seized by federal agents. I signaled to Greg with a subtle nod, indicating that I would take the next service rotation near the Kensingtons. I needed to hear their conversation. I needed to witness the exact depths of Linda's delusion before I tore it all down. I stepped quietly onto the stone terrace, my rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound as I approached their gathering. I held my silver tray with practiced grace, moving to clear the empty dessert plates from the small cocktail table where the group had congregated. As I reached out to collect a delicate porcelain plate, Ashley's sharp, predatory eyes locked onto my oversized uniform. The sycophantic smile she had been aiming at Beatrice Kensington vanished in an instant, replaced by a dark, malicious sneer. She saw a golden opportunity to elevate her own social standing by publicly crushing someone she deemed completely beneath her. "Oh, watch what you are doing with those dirty plates!" Ashley snapped, her voice deliberately loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "You are going to spill something on my custom silk gown and ruin my entire evening." I paused, keeping my head bowed respectfully, playing the role of the terrified, incompetent server perfectly. I murmured a quiet professional apology and continued clearing the table. Beatrice Kensington raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, looking at me as if I were a foul stain on the historic stone terrace. "Goodness, Ashley," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with casual, devastating elitism. "The service staff here seems remarkably unpolished for such an expensive venue. I would have expected Harrison Thorne's preferred event company to employ a much higher caliber of worker. This girl looks completely lost." Linda seized the opening instantly. She let out a loud theatrical sigh, placing a manicured hand on Beatrice's arm in a gesture of shared wealthy suffering. "You will have to forgive her, Beatrice," Linda said, projecting her voice so that every word landed like a physical blow. "That is just Bethany. We had to practically beg the event managers to let her work tonight. She is my niece, unfortunately." Beatrice and Charles Kensington stared at me, their faces contorting with immediate palpable disgust. "Your niece?" Charles asked, his upper lip curling into a harsh sneer. "Why on earth would you allow a family member to clear dirty plates at your daughter's luxury rehearsal dinner? It is incredibly unseemly." Linda shook her head, adopting a mask of tragic maternal burden. "It is a terrible, heartbreaking situation, Charles. When her deadbeat mother died years ago, I took her in out of the sheer goodness of my heart. I paid all her astronomical medical bills out of my own pocket. I gave her a roof over her head. But some people simply refuse to be helped. She dropped out of life completely. She has no ambition, no education, and absolutely no class. She is a total charity case." Ashley chimed in, her voice dripping with venomous pleasure. "We try to include her out of pure pity. We really do. But she is just a waitress. She cannot hold down a real career. She is completely financially unstable and incredibly emotionally fragile. We allow her to serve at these elite events so she can make a few meager dollars in tips to pay back the massive debt she owes my mother. Honestly, having her here is an act of profound family charity. We are the only reason she is not living in the dangerous gutters of the city." The Kensingtons looked at me as though I were a diseased animal that had somehow wandered onto their pristine estate. Beatrice actually took a physical step backward, pulling her emerald gown away from me to ensure the expensive fabric did not accidentally brush against my black apron. "It is truly admirable of you to bear such a humiliating burden," Linda Beatrice said, her voice laced with absolute contempt for me. "I certainly would not tolerate that kind of parasitic behavior in my family line. A girl like that is nothing but a permanent shameful stain on your social standing. You are far too generous to allow her to be seen in polite society." I stood perfectly still, the heavy silver tray resting securely on my fingertips. The sheer cruelty of their words washed over me, toxic and suffocating, but it did not penetrate my armor. 10 years ago, this public humiliation would have broken me. I would have run to the restroom in tears, utterly destroyed by their vicious, coordinated attack. I would have believed every single word they said, internalizing the shame and the engineered poverty they forced upon me. But tonight I felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical anticipation. I looked at Linda radiating manufactured wealth that was entirely funded by my stolen trust fund. I looked at Ashley, desperate for the validation of a haughty, elitist family who would abandon her the second they realized she was completely bankrupt. I looked at Beatrice and Charles Kensington, judging my worth based on a baggy black uniform and a malicious fabricated lie. I did not break character. I did not raise my voice or defend my honor. I simply smiled. It was a polite, perfectly submissive, deeply chilling smile. I sincerely apologize if my presence has caused any discomfort this evening, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. I assure you I am only here to ensure that you get exactly what you deserve. I will clear these plates out of your way immediately so you can continue enjoying the celebration. I bowed my head respectfully, collected the remaining crystal glasses, and turned away from the group. I could feel their judgmental eyes burning into my back as I walked across the stone terrace, but I did not falter. My steps were measured, silent, and incredibly deliberate. Every single insult they hurled at me was just another nail in their own coffin. Every mocking laugh was a strict guarantee of their total and absolute destruction. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist, blindly dancing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. I walked away from the glittering string lights and the sophisticated sounds of the string quartet pushing through the heavy service doors and stepping back into the brightly lit, chaotic environment of the main catering kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of roasted garlic and expensive truffles, the sound of 30 highly trained culinary professionals moving with precise, coordinated urgency. Greg looked up from his clipboard as I approached my private office at the back of the kitchen. He saw the cold, determined look in my eyes and gave me a single sharp nod of understanding. He knew the final phase of our massive operation had been triggered. I stepped into the quiet, soundproof office and locked the heavy door behind me. I set the heavy silver tray down on the desk, my hands completely steady. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying a secured, encrypted messaging channel connecting me directly to Harrison Thorne and his elite legal team. They had been waiting on standby for the past 4 hours, heavily monitoring the situation from a high-tech command center downtown. I opened the chat application. I thought about the 33 years of brutal poverty, the grueling double shifts, the $60,000 fake debt, and the violent, agonizing humiliation I had just endured. I thought about my mother Elaine and the $2 million Linda had callously stolen from her dying hands. I took a deep, grounding breath, feeling the full, terrifying power of the multi-million-dollar empire I had built from absolute scratch. I tapped the digital keyboard, my fingers flying across the glowing screen with lethal, unrelenting precision. I typed the final command, sealing the permanent fate of the women who had ruthlessly tormented me for my entire adult life. The trap is set. It is time. Saturday evening arrived with a display of stolen wealth and unearned arrogance. The Grand Azure Ballroom had been transformed into a sanctuary of excess. The crystal canopy that Ashley demanded hung suspended over the dance floor, catching light from chandeliers and fracturing it into a million prisms. Thousands of rare white orchids cascaded down the marble pillars, filling the room with a rich fragrance. The tables were draped in expensive cold ivory silk. 300 elite citizens sat in velvet chairs dining on beluga caviar and wagyu beef. It was a monument to absolute greed. Ashley sat beside Preston, radiating a victorious energy. She wore a bridal gown encrusted with pearls, looking out over the ballroom as if she had conquered the city. Linda sat to her right, sipping champagne from a crystal flute. She spent dinner leaning across the table, boasting to Preston's parents, making sure Charles and Beatrice knew exactly how much money was poured into this evening. Linda believed her extortion plot had succeeded flawlessly, establishing her permanent dominance. I remained out of sight, orchestrating the final movements of my master plan from the control room overlooking the ballroom. I had stripped off the oversized black catering uniform and the baseball cap. I was no longer playing the part of the broken server. I stood in the shadows wearing a floor-length designer gown in a deep midnight blue. The heavy silk fabric draped perfectly over my frame, projecting an image of uncompromising power. My hair was professionally styled, swept back to highlight the sharp angles of my face. I looked exactly like the chief executive officer of a corporation. I looked like Harrison Thorne's daughter, ready to reclaim her stolen life. Down on the ballroom floor, the dinner service was concluding. My staff moved through the room with precision, clearing the final plates and pouring champagne for the toasts. I watched the security monitors. My event managers were exactly where they needed to be. The audio technicians had the sound system primed and locked. Harrison sat at a primary VIP table near the front of the stage. He wore a black tuxedo, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. He glanced up toward the control room window. He could not see me through the tinted glass, but he knew exactly where I was. The final act was beginning. Ashley stood up, picking up a silver spoon and tapping it against her champagne flute. The sound cut through the low hum of wealthy conversations. The 300 elite guests slowly turned their attention toward the bride. The ballroom grew quiet. Ashley stepped up to the silver microphone stand placed in the center of the dance floor. She adjusted the microphone with a dramatic flourish, smoothing the skirt of her pearl-encrusted gown. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight." Ashley began, her voice amplified perfectly through the sound system. Her tone was dripping with a manufactured humility. Looking out at this stunning room, I am overwhelmed with profound gratitude. Preston and I are so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by such an elite, wonderful group of family and friends on our special day. The guests offered a polite round of applause. Linda beamed with pride, raising her glass toward her daughter. Ashley let the applause fade before her eyes locked onto Harrison. "But tonight is not just about me and Preston." Ashley said, her voice growing louder, vibrating with sheer unapologetic gloating. "Tonight is about family coming together and healing wounds. We have a very special guest with us this evening, a man who recently reconnected with our family after being away for many years. He wanted to make a grand gesture to show his profound appreciation for everything my mother and I have done. He wanted to thank us for carrying certain heavy burdens, so he did not have to." Ashley pointed her manicured hand directly at Harrison. The spotlight shifted, illuminating the billionaire in his tuxedo. The entire room turned to stare at him, recognizing the famous titan of industry. "I want to take this public moment to formally thank my very generous new uncle, Harrison Thorne." Ashley declared, a massive greedy smile stretching across her face. Harrison stepped up and personally funded this entire $300,000 luxury event. He gave us an unlimited budget to ensure this night was absolute perfection. He wanted to reward our family for our lifelong sacrifices. So please, everyone, raise your glasses to Harrison Thorne. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. 300 guests raised their flutes, cheering for the billionaire's staggering generosity. Linda was clapping louder than anyone else, a look of pure, triumphant malice shining in her eyes. She thought she had completely humiliated him, forcing him to publicly finance her daughter's extravagant lifestyle as a penalty for his past. She thought she had established her dominance over the Thorne fortune. Harrison did not smile. He did not raise a glass. He simply stood up from his VIP table and calmly buttoned his tuxedo jacket. The applause slowly died down as he began walking toward the center of the dance floor. His steps were measured, deliberate, and confident. The commanding presence that made him a feared corporate shark instantly filled the massive ballroom. Ashley, looking slightly confused by his intense demeanor, surrendered the microphone to him. Harrison grasped the silver microphone stand. He looked out over the sea of expectant faces, sweeping his gaze across the room until he made direct eye contact with Linda. "Thank you, Ashley." "Harrison," said his voice, a powerful rumble that commanded absolute silence. "It is true that this evening is a staggering display of wealth. The imported orchids, the crystal canopy, the vintage champagne. It is indeed a $300,000 event. And you are correct that I was involved in ensuring this specific level of luxury was achieved tonight." Linda puffed out her chest, looking at Beatrice Kensington with a smug, validated sneer. Ashley smiled brightly, preparing to soak up more public praise. However, Harrison continued, his tone shifting into a sharp, razor-thin frequency. There is a significant correction that must be made regarding the financial mechanics of this evening. I did not actually pay for this wedding. I did not write a single check to cover these extravagant costs. A sudden collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The elite guests murmured in deep confusion. Ashley's bright smile vanished. Linda sat up straight, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the head table. Her eyes widened as a spike of panic hit her system. "What I did," Harrison stated, projecting his voice so it echoed off the marble walls, "was personally guarantee the vendor contracts. I simply ensured that the event management company executing this flawless reception had the absolute legal authorization to operate without budget constraints. I guaranteed that the final invoice would be paid in full by the individuals who aggressively signed the binding legal documents in my corporate office 3 weeks ago." Preston looked at Ashley, his brow furrowed in severe confusion. Charles leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at Linda. The atmosphere in the room plummeted from celebratory to incredibly tense. "But we are not here to discuss legal accounting," Harrison said, completely ignoring the rising panic at the head table. "We are here to celebrate the true architect of this evening. When the demand was made for a luxury wedding, I insisted that only one specific elite private catering and event management company be hired for the job. I insisted on this company because I know the chief executive officer personally. I know her drive, her relentless work ethic, and her profound resilience." Harrison turned away from Linda and faced the heavy oak double doors leading to the main service corridor. "For the past 5 years, this CEO has operated entirely from the shadows," Harrison announced, his voice ringing with fierce, overwhelming pride. "She built a multi-million-dollar corporate empire from absolute scratch. She worked double shifts and survived unimaginable psychological abuse. She was told her entire life that she was a burden, a charity case, a failure. She was treated like a worthless servant by the very people who stole her future. But she never broke. She simply outsmarted them all." The ballroom was dead silent. Nobody moved a single muscle. The guests held their breath, completely captivated by the billionaire's intense, dramatic speech. "It is my profound honor," Harrison declared, his voice echoing with absolute triumph, "to finally introduce the brilliant owner of the company that orchestrated this entire evening. She is not just a vendor. She is not a waitress. She is my flesh and blood. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my daughter, Bethany Thorne." The heavy double doors swung violently open. The grand spotlight snapped away from the stage and hit the entryway, illuminating the dark corridor. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the blinding light, shedding my waitressing facade forever. The collective gasp of 300 guests sucked the oxygen out of the massive Grand Azure ballroom. The heavy oak double doors swung shut behind me with a resounding thud. I walked forward into the blinding spotlight, my midnight blue silk designer gown gliding effortlessly across the polished marble floor. The oversized black catering uniform, the baseball cap, the heavy tray of dirty dishes, they were all completely gone. In their place stood the true chief executive officer of the elite company they had been terrorizing for weeks. I kept my head held high and my posture perfectly straight, radiating the exact same terrifying corporate authority as the billionaire standing on the dance floor. Linda looked as though she had been physically struck by a speeding freight train. The vintage champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers and shattered against the edge of the head table. It was the exact same sound of breaking crystal that had started this entire sequence of events just weeks ago. Ashley let out a strangled, breathless sound. She grabbed the edge of the ivory silk tablecloth, her knuckles turning completely white as she stared at my transformation. Preston sat frozen in his velvet chair, his eyes darting frantically between my sudden appearance and the furious, calculating expression of his father, Charles Kensington. Beatrice Kensington pressed a trembling hand to her heavy diamond necklace, her mouth opening and closing in absolute, unadulterated shock. I reached the center of the dance floor and stopped right next to Harrison. He smiled a proud, lethal smile and handed me the silver microphone. The entire ballroom was so incredibly silent, you could hear the soft rustle of expensive fabrics as guests leaned forward in their seats. I looked directly at my aunt and my cousin. I did not blink. I did not waver. I held the absolute power in the room. Thank you for the lovely introduction, I said, my voice echoing clearly and powerfully through the premium surround sound system. It has been an absolute privilege to cater this evening. Ashley, your relentless demands for imported beluga caviar, rare out-of-season white orchids, and a custom crystal canopy truly pushed my elite event staff to their creative limits. And Linda, your constant arrogant boasts about how you controlled my father's bank accounts provided excellent, highly amusing entertainment for my entire management team. Linda scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with a violent, panicked red. The illusion of her aristocratic grace completely evaporated. "Turn off that microphone right now!" Linda shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Security! Remove her from this room immediately. This is a private luxury event. She is trespassing. I am the sole owner of the event company managing this venue," I reminded her coldly, my voice cutting through her panic like a razor blade. "My security team answers exclusively to me, and they are currently locking the ballroom doors to ensure nobody interrupts the final presentation of the evening. You see, Linda, earlier tonight during the rehearsal dinner, you cornered me in the estate restroom. You thought I was just a broken, terrified waitress. You made a very specific, highly illegal demand. You threatened to destroy my entire life if I did not extort my father." Ashley shook her head frantically, grabbing Preston's tuxedo sleeve. Preston violently pulled his arm away, staring at Linda with mounting horror. Linda pointed a shaking, accusing finger at me from the head table. "She is lying," Linda screamed to the wealthy crowd, desperate to maintain her crumbling facade. "She is deeply mentally ill. I told you all, she suffers from violent delusions. Do not listen to a single word she says." I did not argue with her frantic lies. I simply looked up toward the tinted glass of the control room overlooking the ballroom and gave Greg a sharp, single nod. The ballroom's premium sound system crackled to life. The audio file I had secretly encrypted and sent to Harrison's legal team played at maximum volume. The pristine, digitally enhanced audio echoed off the high ceilings and marble pillars for 300 of Chicago's most elite citizens to hear. Linda's vicious, venomous voice filled the massive room, capturing the exact moment she sealed her own fate. "You are going to convince your rich daddy to buy Ashley a $5 million house," the recorded voice of Linda hissed over the speakers. "Or I will show him the fake psych evaluations I kept from your teenage years. He will think you are insane and lock you in a ward." The audio continued to play, relentlessly broadcasting her darkest criminal threats to the silent, horrified audience. "I paid a very expensive doctor to document that you suffer from severe, violent delusions and paranoid schizophrenia." The recording blared. "If you say one word against me, I will hand those files directly to Harrison's corporate lawyers. He will think you are a danger to yourself. He will lock you in a psychiatric ward and throw away the key just to protect his brand. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life heavily medicated in a padded white room, and I will still get my money." The recording clicked off, plunging the ballroom back into a deafening, suffocating silence. The absolute cruelty of her felony extortion hung in the air, toxic and entirely undeniable. The wealthy guests stared at Linda in complete and utter revulsion. Charles Kensington stood up from his chair, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. Beatrice looked as though she was going to be physically sick. They had just listened to a woman cheerfully admit to fabricating medical records and threatening to institutionalize her own niece for pure financial gain. Harrison stepped forward, taking the silver microphone back from my hand. He looked at Linda, his stormy gray eyes completely devoid of mercy. "Extortion and wire fraud are severe federal crimes," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. "But the massive theft you committed 33 years ago is the true reason we are standing here tonight. You proudly told this room that I funded this wedding." Harrison continued, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the elite guests. "You loudly told your country club friends that I was your personal bank account. Let me clarify exactly how this evening was financed. I did not pay for a single white orchid. I did not pay for a single drop of vintage champagne. I simply guaranteed the vendor contracts, ensuring my daughter's catering company would not suffer any financial loss when you inevitably defaulted. The actual bill for this extravagant $300,000 reception goes directly to the person who stole my daughter's $2 million blind trust fund. The guests gasped again, louder and more scandalized this time. Ashley whipped her head around to look at her mother, genuine shock registering on her heavily made-up face. A stolen trust fund. The false narrative of the generous sacrificing aunt had completely evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a calculating, ruthless criminal. Before Elaine passed away, I established a secure $2 million blind trust specifically for her medical care and my daughter's future, Harrison explained to the horrified crowd. Linda forged Elaine's signature, illegally drained the accounts, and used that stolen fortune to purchase her luxury suburban mansion and fund Ashley's elite lifestyle. She then manufactured a fake $60,000 medical debt, trapping my daughter in poverty and forcing her to work double shifts just to survive. I reached into the hidden pocket of my midnight blue silk gown and pulled out a thick formal ivory envelope. It contained the final itemized invoice for the entire wedding reception. Every single luxury upgrade, every rare orchid, every ounce of Wagyu beef, and every expensive bottle of premium champagne was meticulously documented. I walked away from Harrison and approached the head table. The crowd parted from me instinctively, granting me a wide path of respect. I stopped directly in front of Linda and Ashley. Linda was actively hyperventilating, clutching her chest as her entire fake social empire burned to ash around her. Ashley was weeping uncontrollably, her heavy bridal makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. I placed the heavy ivory envelope directly onto Ashley's pristine silk tablecloth, resting it right next to her empty crystal flute. "Here is the final bill for your perfect evening," I said, my voice cold and completely steady. $300,000 payable immediately to my corporate holding company. As per the strict legal contracts you both aggressively signed in my father's executive office, this massive debt is secured directly against your personal assets. You bypassed my father's corporate accounts entirely when you repeatedly demanded those luxury upgrades. This debt belongs exclusively to you. Ashley looked at the ivory envelope as if it were a live ticking explosive. She turned to Preston, grabbing his tuxedo sleeve with desperate, trembling hands. "Preston," she sobbed, her voice high and utterly panicked. "Preston, you have to help us. Your family can easily cover this. We are married now. We are family. Please tell your father to write a check to fix this." Preston stared at her, his face a portrait of absolute revulsion. He looked at Linda, who was still gasping for air, and then he looked at me, standing tall and victorious in my designer gown. He finally saw the complete truth. He had not married into a wealthy aristocratic bloodline. He had tied himself to a pair of broke, malicious criminals who had just been publicly exposed for extortion, fraud, and embezzlement on the grandest scale imaginable. Preston stood up slowly, roughly pulling his arm out of Ashley's desperate grasp. He did not say a single reassuring word to her. He reached up to the lapel of his expensive tuxedo jacket and violently ripped off the rare white orchid boutonniere. He threw the crushed flower directly onto the itemized $300,000 invoice resting on the table. He turned his back on his weeping bride, stepped down from the head table, and walked straight out of the ballroom, his furious parents following closely behind him. Ashley let out a piercing, hysterical scream as the heavy oak doors swung shut behind the Kensington family. The sound tore through the absolute silence of the Grand Azure ballroom, raw and utterly pathetic. She lunged forward, her pearl-encrusted bridal gown tangling around her legs, as she scrambled to follow Preston. She tripped over the hem of her expensive dress, falling hard onto the polished marble floor. She crawled toward the exit, sobbing violently, screaming his name. But the doors remained completely shut. The wealthy groom was gone, taking her entire future, her social standing, and her desperate delusion of high society grandeur with him. The elite guests watched the bride's total meltdown with a mixture of sheer horror and morbid fascination. The opulent reception had officially transformed into a spectacular, unprecedented disaster. Linda stood frozen at the head table, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Her chest heaved violently as she desperately struggled to draw a single breath. She looked around the massive ballroom, meeting the judgmental, disgusted stares of the Chicago elite she had spent her entire life trying to impress. The people she had boasted to at her exclusive country club were now witnessing her absolute humiliating ruin. Linda turned her frantic gaze back to me. The arrogant, controlling monster who had tormented me for 33 years was completely gone. In her place stood a terrified, trapped animal. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to launch another vicious threat, or to spin another desperate manufactured lie. But before a single word could escape her lips, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung violently open once again. Ashley gasped, pushing herself up from the marble floor, a desperate tear-stained smile breaking across her ruined face. She thought her wealthy savior had come back to forgive her and rescue her from the nightmare, but it was not Preston Kensington. The lead attorney from my father's ruthless legal team walked through the doors with absolute terrifying authority. He was flanked by two other high-powered corporate lawyers. And right behind them marched 6 federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers, bearing the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sheer visual impact of federal agents storming into a luxury wedding reception sent a massive shockwave through the elite crowd. Several guests actually stood up from their velvet chairs, completely terrified by the sudden escalation. The agents moved with swift, tactical precision, fanning out across the ballroom to secure all the primary exits. The lead attorney did not pause. He marched straight down the center of the dance floor, leading 2 senior FBI agents directly toward the head table where Linda was actively hyperventilating. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the marble, a steady, rhythmic countdown to Linda's permanent destruction. Linda backed away, her hands shaking violently as she bumped into the towering floral arrangements. She knocked over a crystal vase, sending water and glass crashing to the floor, but nobody paid any attention to the mess. They were entirely focused on the federal agents closing in on the corrupt, thieving matriarch. Linda Thorne, the lead attorney, stated, his voice booming across the silent ballroom without the need for a microphone. I am serving you with an immediate federal injunction and an emergency asset freeze authorized by the United States District Court. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of legal documents. He slammed them down onto the ivory silk tablecloth right on top of the crushed white orchid Preston had discarded. The federal authorities have spent the last 72 hours conducting a comprehensive forensic audit of your financial history. He continued, his tone clinical, objective, and utterly devastating. They have traced the exact path of the $2 million you illegally drained from Elaine Thorne's blind trust 33 years ago. They have tracked every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake medical invoice, and every shell account you utilized to launder the stolen capital. Linda shook her head frantically, pressing her hands against her ears as if she could physically block out the charges. This is a mistake, she gasped, her voice barely a rough, breathless wheeze. I did not steal anything. I am innocent. You are framing me. I will not let you do this to me. One of the senior FBI agents stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Linda Thorne, you are under formal investigation for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, grand larceny, embezzlement, and felony extortion, the agent announced, his voice carrying the absolute weight of federal law. As of this exact moment, every single bank account associated with your name, your business entities, and your immediate family members has been completely frozen. Your suburban mansion, your luxury vehicles, and all physical assets purchased with the stolen funds have been seized by the federal government pending criminal prosecution. Ashley let out a piercing, agonizing wail. She finally understood the true devastating reality of her situation. She was not just losing a wealthy husband. She was losing her home, her car, her designer clothes, and every single cent she had ever possessed. She was completely and entirely bankrupt. The elite guests in the ballroom began to whisper loudly, the sound swelling into a deafening roar of pure, scandalized gossip. Country club members who had played tennis with Linda just last week were now recording her federal downfall on their smartphones. The social destruction was absolute and irreversible. Linda had spent her entire adult life trying to climb to the very top of the Chicago social ladder, crushing me beneath her designer heels to get there. Now she was being violently dragged down to the absolute bottom in front of the exact audience she craved the most. The lead attorney turned his sharp, predatory gaze toward Ashley, who was still sobbing on the marble floor. And for the record, Ashley, the emergency asset freeze includes all funds associated with this wedding reception. The $300,000 invoice resting on that table is now a legally binding debt tied directly to your frozen, worthless estate. You have absolutely zero capital to pay my client's catering company. You are completely destitute. The reality of the situation finally shattered Linda's last remaining shred of arrogant defiance. The imposing, terrifying monster who had haunted my entire childhood completely broke apart. Her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, the expensive fabric of her mother of the bride dress soaking up the spilled champagne and dirty water. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The federal agent stepped closer, preparing to read her Miranda rights, but she ignored them. She crawled across the damp floor, dragging herself toward where I stood next to Harrison. "Bethany, please." Linda begged, her voice a wet, ugly sob. "Please, you have to stop them. You have to tell Harrison to call off his lawyers. We are family. I raised you. I took you in when you had nobody else. You cannot let them put me in federal prison. I will not survive it. I am your aunt. We are blood." Ashley scrambled over to join her mother, clutching the hem of my midnight blue silk gown with her trembling, desperate hands. "Bethany, I am so sorry." Ashley wailed, her tears staining the expensive fabric of my dress. "I was wrong. I was so horrible to you. Please, I have absolutely nothing left. Preston is gone. My life is completely ruined. Please, just forgive us. Show us some mercy. We are a family. You cannot just throw us away." I looked down at the two women groveling at my feet. For 33 years, they had looked at me exactly like this, like a pathetic, worthless bug they could crush whenever they pleased. They had starved me, humiliated me, and threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward just 2 days ago. They did not care about family. They only cared about family now because their stolen bank accounts were empty and federal agents were holding steel handcuffs. I felt Harrison shift beside me. He was watching me closely, giving me the complete space and authority to handle the final execution. He was the billionaire titan who had orchestrated the tactical strike, but this specific revenge belonged entirely to me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The heavy, suffocating chain that had been wrapped tightly around my neck since childhood shattered into a million tiny pieces. I was finally, completely free. I looked down into Linda's terrified, pleading eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or show any trace of the anger that had burned inside me for decades. I remained perfectly calm, radiating the cold, untouchable authority of a true chief executive officer. "You are not my family, Linda," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the silent, captivated ballroom. "My mother was my family, and you robbed her while she was dying. You stole her money, and then you tried to steal my entire future." I gently pulled the fabric of my silk gown out of Ashley's desperate, grasping hands. I stepped back, severing the physical connection between us forever. "Earlier tonight, you stood on the stone terrace and proudly told Preston's wealthy parents exactly what you thought of me." I continued, my gaze locked onto Linda's weeping face. "You told them I was a charity case. You told them I dropped out of life to serve your drinks. You told them I was a pathetic waitress who existed solely to carry your dirty plates and pay off my debts." Linda sobbed louder, burying her face in her hands as the federal agents moved in closer, preparing to pull her up from the floor. "Well, I am officially clearing your table," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy whisper that chilled the room. "I am just giving you the check." I turned my back on them without another word. I did not watch as the federal agents grabbed Linda by the arms and hauled her to her feet. I did not listen as the steel handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. I did not look back as Ashley screamed in absolute despair, surrounded by the flashing cameras of the wealthy guests who were eagerly documenting her spectacular ruin. Harrison reached out and offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his, feeling the solid, unshakable strength of my true family. The 300 elite guests parted immediately, creating a wide, respectful path for us to exit the ballroom. They lowered their heads as we walked past, acknowledging the shift in power. We walked out the heavy oak double doors and stepped into the cool, quiet Chicago night. The oppressive, toxic ghosts of my past were permanently locked away behind us, buried under a mountain of federal indictments and public humiliation. I stepped out of the shadows of the restaurant service industry and took my rightful place in the world. I was no longer Bethany, the terrified, indebted waitress. I was Bethany Thorne, a highly successful corporate CEO, a multi-million-dollar business owner, and a billionaire's daughter. And my life was finally mine to live.